She was worth over $1 billion, had armies of assistants, and hadn't pumped her own gas in 4 years. But tonight, Charlotte Hayes was stuck on a black mountain road in a dead car, rain hammering the roof, no signal on her phone, and absolutely no one coming. Then headlights cut through the dark. A battered pickup pulled over. A man in a grease-stained jacket stepped out without hesitation. No recognition in his eyes, no angle, no agenda. Just a guy who stopped because someone needed help. She didn't know it yet, but this stranger had already saved her life once before. If this story already has you hooked, hit that like button right now, drop a comment with the city you're watching from, and follow all the way to the end. Let's see how far this story travels. The storm came in fast off the ridge, the way storms always did in late October up in the Cascades. 1 minute the sky was just low and gray, the kind of gray that meant business but hadn't committed yet. And the next it was a full black wall rolling over the pine tops with rain so hard it turned headlights into blur. Charlotte Hayes had driven these mountain roads maybe a dozen times over the past 3 years, always during the day, always in reasonable weather, always with a fully charged phone and a schedule to justify the trip. Tonight she had none of those things. The Range Rover had started making a sound somewhere around mile marker 47, a low, unhappy grinding from somewhere under the hood that her dashboard couldn't name, but that her gut recognized immediately as expensive. She'd ignored it for another 6 miles because she was on a call she couldn't drop. Her COO was walking her through a Q3 projection that had come in 15% below estimate, and her VP of operations was on the same line trying to explain why, and neither of them was doing a particularly convincing job. By the time she ended the call and started actually paying attention to the grinding, the Range Rover had already made its decision for her. It died on a switchback curve with no shoulder worth mentioning, just a guardrail on one side and a drop she couldn't see the bottom of on the other. The engine didn't even sputter dramatically. It just quit, like it had been waiting for the worst possible moment and had been patient about finding it. Charlotte steered it to the very edge of the narrow pull-off, put it in park, and sat there for a moment listening to the rain. Her phone had 1 bar. She tried her assistant first. Went to voicemail. She tried her driver, Marcus, who normally would have been behind the wheel of this exact vehicle on a night like this, except she'd given him the day off because she was supposed to be back in the city by 6, and she'd wanted the drive alone. She hadn't wanted to talk to anyone. She'd wanted 2 hours of mountain dark and whatever music felt right, and no one asking her anything. Instead, she got this. She pulled up roadside assistance and got a 45-minute estimated wait time, which the automated system revised to 63 minutes while she was still on hold. She got out of the car to see if the signal was better standing up, which it wasn't, and she immediately got soaked through her coat from the shoulders down because she'd left her actual rain jacket in her city apartment and had been meaning to move it to the mountain house for 3 weeks. She was back in the car, wringing water out of her hair, trying to figure out if the roadside app worked better on low data, when the headlights appeared. They came around the curve slower than she expected. Most people came around that particular curve too fast, especially in the rain, which was half the reason she'd been nervous about her position on the shoulder. But this vehicle slowed almost immediately when the driver must have seen her hazard lights. A full-size pickup, older, the kind that had been through things. It pulled up behind her with its emergency flashers on and sat there for a moment. Charlotte watched in the side mirror. She wasn't afraid exactly, but she was aware. 30-year-old woman alone on a mountain road at 9 at night. Awareness wasn't paranoia, it was just sense. She had her phone in her hand and she'd already noted that her door locks were down. The driver's door opened and a man climbed out. He was tall, somewhere in his early 30s, wearing a canvas work jacket that had seen several hundred more days of use than it was originally designed for. He had one of those faces that was hard to read at a distance. Square jaw, dark eyes, the kind of tired that settled in around the corners of a person's eyes, not from one bad night, but from a long accumulation of them. He walked toward her car without rushing, hands visible, no particular expression. He stopped a few feet from her window. She cracked it 2 inches. "You need help?" His voice was flat, practical, no performance in it. "Broke down. I've got roadside on the way." "How long they say?" "An hour, maybe more." He glanced at the front of her car, then at the guardrail, then at the rain, which had picked up again in the last 60 seconds, as if it had heard the estimate and wanted to editorialize. "You want me to take a look?" "I'm a mechanic. I run the shop down in Silver Creek. Charlotte studied him through the 2-inch gap. He wasn't looking at her the way men sometimes looked at her. The recognition look, the slight recalibration when they placed her face from a magazine or a Forbes feature. He was just looking at her car. "You carry tools with you?" "Always." He tilted his head back toward the pickup. "Basic stuff in the truck, more in the bed box." She thought about it for about 3 seconds, which was 2 seconds longer than she'd normally take for a decision this minor. Then she unlocked the car and got out. "Okay, thank you." "Pop the hood." His name was Ethan Brooks, he told her while he was elbow deep in her engine with a flashlight clamped under his arm. He said it the same way he said everything else. Without decoration, just information. He'd been running his own shop in Silver Creek for going on 7 years. Before that, he'd done fleet maintenance for a logistics company in Spokane, which had been good money but bad hours. And before that, he paused here, adjusting the angle of the flashlight. Before that, he'd been in school, but that hadn't worked out. Charlotte stood beside him, holding an umbrella she'd found in the back seat, trying to angle it so it covered both of them without being awkward about it, and said, "What kind of school?" "Engineering." He pulled something loose and examined it. For a while. She waited to see if there was more. There wasn't. He didn't seem bothered by the conversational dead end. He just kept working. The problem turned out to be a coolant hose that had been developing a slow failure for probably months and had chosen tonight to finish the job. He didn't have the exact replacement in his truck, but he had something that would hold. A temporary fix, he said, enough to get her off the mountain safely. He spent maybe 20 minutes on it, working in the rain without complaint, not particularly interested in making conversation, and not awkward about the silence either. When he was almost done, his phone rang. He answered it with one still dirty hand and said, "Hey, Bug." A pause. Then, lower, softer. "I know it's late." "I know. Did you eat the pasta?" Another pause, and something happened to his face. The tiredness was still there, but something else came through it. Something warm and specific, and entirely different from everything that had come before it. "Peanut butter on what?" "That's not dinner, Lily. That's a snack trying to pretend it's dinner." Charlotte heard a child's voice through the phone, tinny and distant, clearly arguing this point with great enthusiasm. Ethan listened, and he smiled, just briefly, and it changed his face entirely. He said, Okay, I'm on my way. Leave the pasta in the fridge. I'll heat it up when I get home. Stay with Mrs. Calloway until I knock, you hear me? Don't open the door for anyone else." He hung up and looked back at the engine. "Almost done." Charlotte said, "Your daughter?" "Yeah." He tightened something, checked it, wiped his hands on a rag from his jacket pocket. 8 years old, and she thinks peanut butter on saltines is a nutritional argument. That sounds like a position that should be taken seriously. He looked up, a flicker of something. Not quite a smile, but related to one. "She'd agree with you." He lowered the hood carefully and said, "You should be okay to drive. Keep the heat off for the first 15 minutes. Don't push it past 60. The hose will hold, but it's not permanent. Get it to a proper shop before you drive it again after tonight. Can I bring it to yours?" He looked at her for a moment like he was recalibrating something. "Sure, we're on Carpenter Street, south end of town. Opens at 8. "I'll be there at 8. He nodded. He was already walking back toward his truck. Charlotte said, "Wait, what do I owe you for this?" "Nothing." "That's not drive safe." He said it over his shoulder, and he meant it in the same way he meant everything else he'd said. Plain, with no angle behind it. The truck door closed. He waited until she'd started her car and pulled out before he followed her down the mountain, staying behind her all the way to the county highway, where the road widened and she could pick up speed. Then his lights turned off toward town, and she kept going toward the freeway on-ramp, and that was that. Or it should have been. Charlotte drove the remaining 40 minutes home on a road that had dried up somewhere past the foothills, the Range Rover running normally, the temporary hose holding exactly as promised. She had a glass of water in her kitchen and checked her messages. 17 of them, which was actually light for a Monday. And she went through 3 of them before she stopped and stood at her kitchen counter with the phone in her hand, not reading anything. "I'm on my way. Stay with Mrs. Calloway until I knock. Don't open the door for anyone else." She didn't know why that stuck. She'd heard parents talk to kids on the phone before. She'd overheard 1,000 variations of it in airports and restaurants and hotel lobbies. But something about his voice in that particular moment, the shift in register, the patience, the specific and particular warmth of it aimed at one specific and particular person, had landed somewhere she hadn't expected. She went to bed. She lay in the dark for a while. Then she got up, got her laptop, and typed into her search bar, Ethan Brooks, Silver Creek, Auto Repair. His shop had a basic website. Not much. A few photos, the address, the hours, a short bio that said the shop had been founded in 2017 and specialized in domestic and foreign vehicles, fleet maintenance, and mountain weather prep. The photo on the About page was small and not great quality, but it was him. Work jacket, same expression, standing in front of a garage bay with a car partly visible behind him. Charlotte looked at the photo for a long time. The face, the jaw, the eyes. She closed the laptop and told herself she was tired. She wasn't tired. Shit. She was in Silver Creek by 9:30 the next morning. The shop was easy to find, a 3-bay garage on a corner lot with a hand-painted sign that said Brooks Auto above the entrance. The paint slightly faded, the letters done in a style that suggested the painter had been competent but not a professional sign maker. There were 2 vehicles already pulled in, a mid-90s Ford pickup on a lift and a late-model Subaru parked beside the second bay. A country music station was playing from somewhere inside, just audible over the compressor noise. Ethan came out wiping his hands on a shop rag when he heard her pull in. He recognized the Range Rover before he recognized her, and then he looked up and something shifted in his expression. Not surprise exactly, more like a quick internal accounting. "You made it down okay." "I did. You said 8, but I had a call." "No problem." He walked around the vehicle, already looking. "I'll get to it in about an hour." "You need a ride somewhere while you wait?" "I'll walk around town." "Is there a coffee shop?" "Marta's, 2 blocks north on Main. Tell her you're waiting on work from me and she'll let you sit as long as you want." Charlotte spent 2 hours at Marta's, which was a small place with mismatched chairs and a chalkboard menu, and a woman behind the counter who was 60-something, built like someone who had carried things her whole life, and almost aggressively friendly. Marta did, in fact, let her sit as long as she wanted. She brought her coffee without being asked a second time and didn't try to make conversation when it was clear Charlotte was working, and when Charlotte looked up from her laptop at one point and asked, "Do you know Ethan Brooks well?" Marta leaned on the counter and said, "Since he was about 12, in a tone that communicated that this was not a casual question and would not receive a casual answer. "What can you tell me about him?" Marta studied her with frankly appraising eyes. "Why?" "He helped me on the road last night. I'm curious." "Lots of people he's helped on that road." Marta poured herself a coffee and didn't move away. "Ethan grew up here. His dad ran a garage too, same spot actually, different name. His mom left when he was young, so it was just him and his dad. He was smart, real smart, the kind of smart that teachers got excited about. Got himself a scholarship to state, engineering program. Big deal for this town." She paused. "Then his dad got sick. Cancer, first time. Ethan came home his second year and never went back. Dad recovered, which was good, but Ethan never left again. I don't know if that was entirely about his dad or partly about other things." "What other things?" Marta gave her a long look. "You ask a lot for somebody who's just curious." Charlotte smiled. "Force of habit." Marta refilled her coffee, unprompted. "He had a girl, Lily's mom. They were together a few years, then she was gone. That's all I'll say about that because it's not mine to tell. Lily was 2 when it happened. Ethan's been raising her on his own since." Charlotte looked at her laptop screen, which she wasn't reading. "He seems like he's good at it." "He's real good at it." Marta's voice was softer now, the appraisal gone out of it. "That kid is the whole point of his life. You can see it." She straightened up. "You want a refill?" "Please." "Well." The Range Rover was ready by noon. The bill was fair. Lower than fair, honestly, for the work he'd done. Charlotte stood at the counter in the small waiting area off the shop floor, writing the check, while Ethan filled out the repair order on his side. There was a child's drawing taped to the corner of the register. A yellow truck with enormous wheels, a figure standing beside it in what appeared to be a green cape. Underneath, in careful 8-year-old printing, "My dad's shop." "Lily's?" Charlotte asked. He glanced up. Yeah, she did that last month. Gave it to me for the shop because she said it needed decorating. His tone was dry, but there was pride underneath it, not even slightly hidden. Charlotte looked at the drawing for a moment. The yellow truck. The green cape. She's not wrong. He took her check and processed it and handed back the receipt, and Charlotte said, "Thank you again, for last night and today." "No problem." He was already half turning back toward the shop. "I'll probably be back," she said. It came out more direct than she'd planned, which was a habit she'd never fully broken. "I have the mountain house about 8 miles up the 14. I drive those roads in all weather. I'd rather have a mechanic I trust." Ethan turned back and looked at her steadily. He had a way of looking at people without hurry, without the social instinct to fill silence immediately that most people had. "I'm here Monday through Saturday. Walk-ins are fine if the bay's open, otherwise call ahead." "I'll call ahead." He nodded and went back to his truck on the lift, and Charlotte went to her car, and that should still have been that. But she sat in the parking lot for a moment before starting the engine, looking at the faded letters above the garage door, and she pulled out her phone and opened the photo she'd taken, without quite deciding to, of the drawing taped to the register. The yellow truck. The green cape. My dad's shop. She'd been up since 5 a.m. She had a board call at 3. She had a decision to make about a software acquisition that had to land by end of week. She had 17 unread messages from this morning alone and probably a dozen more since she'd last checked. She sat in the parking lot of a small-town garage and looked at a photograph of a child's drawing and tried to understand what was happening to her, and couldn't quite get there. She drove back to the city. She answered her messages. She took the board call. She made the acquisition decision. No, for reasons that she laid out in a memo that her COO later said was the clearest thinking she'd seen from Charlotte in months, which Charlotte took as both a compliment and a mild indictment. That night she opened her laptop and searched for something she hadn't thought about in years. Cheating accusation, State University Engineering Department, 15 years ago. The results weren't helpful. Too general, too old, too much noise. She tried. Student expulsion overturned, State University, Engineering, 2009-2010. Still nothing specific enough. She sat back and stared at the ceiling of her city apartment and tried to reach back through 15 years of constructed distance to a semester she had mostly worked to forget. The scholarship office, the hearing room, the committee of 3 faculty members who had looked at her across a table with expressions that already contained their verdict. The plagiarism accusation on a project she had completed without help, in full, in the computer lab on the 3rd floor of the engineering building because she couldn't afford the software for her own laptop. She'd been 21 hours from expulsion, 21 hours from losing the scholarship, the program, the entire constructed future she had built from scratch because there had been nothing given to her to start with. And then, the morning of the second hearing, there had been evidence. A signed statement from a lab monitor she'd never spoken to. A keycard access log from the computer lab that corroborated her version of events to the minute. 3 additional supporting documents she had not gathered herself and had not asked anyone to gather. The committee had reviewed them, deliberated for 40 minutes, and cleared her without further condition. She had never found out who compiled those documents. She'd asked the hearing officer, she'd asked the lab monitor, whose statement had been submitted on her behalf without her knowledge. The monitor had said only that a student had come to her and explained the situation and asked if she'd be willing to provide a factual account of what she'd seen. And yes, she'd been willing because the truth was the truth. Who was the student? She hadn't gotten a name. Charlotte had spent a week after the hearing trying to find out. She'd asked around the department. Nobody knew. She'd eventually had to let it go because the semester didn't stop and her workload didn't stop, and she had 4 years of desperate forward motion still in front of her that left no time to look back. She had never let it go exactly. She'd just stopped looking. She opened a new search tab and typed, Ethan Brooks, State University, Engineering, nothing direct, some old social media accounts, long dormant, an alumni forum entry from 2011 asking if anyone knew what had happened to a Brooks, who'd been in the sophomore engineering cohort, someone who remembered him as sharp and quiet and good with systems. The reply was short. Heard he went back home. Family stuff. Charlotte closed the laptop. She lay in the dark for a long time. She didn't sleep until almost 3. Ten. She went back to Silver Creek the following Thursday. She didn't have a car problem. She said she did. A vague rattle she'd noticed, probably nothing. And she brought the Range Rover in, and Ethan checked it in 15 minutes and said it was fine, and she said thank you, and she went to Marta's again. And this time when Marta brought her coffee, she didn't ask questions. She just sat and watched the street outside and drank her coffee and thought about what she was doing and whether she had any good reason for it. Ethan came by Marta's at noon to tell her the car was ready. Charlotte looked up and said, "Do you eat lunch?" He looked at her. "Usually." "Sit down." It was not quite a request, and she knew it, and she saw him register it. He sat down across from her with the particular kind of stillness that suggested he was deciding in real time whether this was a good idea, and had decided provisionally that it was fine, but reserved the right to revise that assessment. Marta came over without being asked and brought him a coffee and said, "Usual?" And he said yes without looking at the menu, which meant he had a usual, which meant he ate here regularly, which meant she'd just invited herself into a routine that was already his. She said, "Tell me about the shop, how it started." He looked at her steadily. "Why?" "I'm curious." "You said that before." "I'm consistently curious." She held his gaze. "You don't have to." A beat. Then he picked up his coffee and said, "It was my dad's first. Different name, Brooks and Sons, which was optimistic since it was always just the two of us, and I wasn't actually working there formally yet. He ran it for 22 years. When he got sick the second time, about 6 years ago, it was clear he couldn't keep it going. I bought it from him for what I had, which wasn't much, and changed the name and took over the accounts." He said it evenly, without self-pity, and without the performance of toughness that people sometimes use to signal they were beyond self-pity. Just the facts of a situation that had required a decision and a person who had made it. "He passed 2 years later, so now it's mine. That part worked out." "That part," Charlotte said. He looked at her. "Most parts work out if you wait long enough." He didn't say it like a fortune cookie. He said it like a man who had checked this against actual evidence and arrived at a provisional conclusion. Marta brought sandwiches. Ethan ate without rushing and answered her questions when she asked them and asked her almost nothing in return. Not from disinterest, but from some sense that questions had to be earned through something other than proximity. Charlotte didn't mind. She was used to rooms where everyone asked her things because they wanted something. A room where someone didn't ask was strange and restful and slightly unnerving all at once. At one point she said, "Were you ever in Mill Haven, the university town?" He stopped chewing for just a fraction of a second. Not long enough to be obvious. Long enough for her to notice, because she was watching. "For a couple years, yeah. I went to State," she said. "Engineering." He looked at her. The eyes were steady. "I know. I recognized your name when you brought the car in." Charlotte went completely still. He picked up his coffee. "You built Hayes Digital. There was a piece in the business section 2 years ago. Local interest angle about Cascades Region CEOs, had a short bio. Said you went to State on scholarship, engineering department." He set the cup down. "I don't follow business news much, but the name stuck. It's not a common one." "Did you know who I was last night? On the road?" "No, dark, rain. I wasn't looking at your face. Figured it out after you left your car, and I saw the registration when I filled out the repair order next morning." Charlotte said carefully, "Do you remember me? From school?" He met her eyes, held them. For a moment the shop noise filtered in from outside, the compressor cycling, the country music from the radio in the bay. Then he said, "No, I don't think so. A lot of people went through that department." It was not entirely convincing, and she was quite certain it was not intended to be. It was the answer of a man who had made a decision about what to say and was saying it with full awareness of what she might be asking underneath the question. She let it sit. She didn't push. They finished lunch. She paid. He didn't protest, which was its own kind of statement, the statement of a man who'd decided not to make a thing into a bigger thing. She got her car. She drove back toward the highway. Halfway down the mountain, she pulled over on a safe turnout and sat there with her hands on the wheel, engine running, the Cascades spread out on all sides in that particular October gold that made everything look like the last good version of itself before winter came to take the color out. She knew. She didn't have proof yet. But she knew with the particular certainty that had made her good at her job, the ability to recognize a truth that the evidence hadn't fully caught up to, that she was sitting within 15 miles of the person who had walked into the engineering department of State University 15 years ago and saved her life without ever introducing himself or asking for anything in return. She had no idea what to do with that. She sat there for a while longer. Then she put the car in gear and drove the rest of the way down, and she was already thinking about when she would come back. She came back 11 days later, and the time after that, 9 days. And then the intervals got shorter, and the excuses for the car got thinner, and somewhere in the middle of November she stopped pretending there was a mechanical reason and just came. She'd come in mid-morning and work from Marta's, and sometimes Ethan would come by at lunch, and sometimes he wouldn't, and when he did, they talked more easily than before, the conversation loosening the way conversations do between people who are starting to locate each other's actual edges. She learned that he listened to exactly 2 genres of music, country and old Motown, and considered everything else optional, that he'd read more than she expected, especially history, with a particular interest in infrastructure and how civilizations collapsed through small maintenance failures no one thought important at the time. That he was quietly funny in a way that required patience to find, because he didn't signal the jokes. He just delivered them in the same tone as everything else and let you catch up. That he had strong opinions about truck suspension and no opinions whatsoever about interior design, which he'd thought about approximately 0 times in his life. She learned about Lily through pieces. The peanut butter dinner was not an isolated incident. Lily had a long-running project of testing whether unconventional food combinations constituted real meals, and Ethan had a long-running project of holding the line on this without being so rigid about it that meals became a battleground. He'd read 3 parenting books in the first year, he said, and mostly concluded that none of them were written about actual children. He figured it out as he went, which he seemed to feel was both the honest answer and the only one. He was worried sometimes that he wasn't giving her enough. He didn't elaborate on this, and she didn't ask him to, because she could hear in the slight shortening of his voice that this was a real worry, and not one he was ready to pull apart in front of someone he'd known a handful of weeks. Charlotte thought about this at night in the city more than she thought about the software acquisition, the Q4 projections, the restructuring plan her COO had been pushing for. She thought about a man who had raised a kid alone in a small town for 6 years and read parenting books and argued about peanut butter dinners and taped children's drawings to his register and worried quietly about whether it was enough. She thought about whether she was going to tell him what she suspected. She thought about what she would say if she did. She hadn't figured out either of those questions yet when, one Thursday in late November, she arrived at Marta's at 9 in the morning and found Lily Brooks sitting in her usual chair. The girl was 8 years old and had her father's dark eyes and absolutely none of his stillness. She was doing homework at the table, or had been doing homework, because the worksheet was pushed to one side and she was currently drawing something on the back of a napkin with a purple pen she'd apparently produced from the pocket of her jacket. She looked up when Charlotte came in and said, without preamble, "Are you the lady from the city?" Charlotte stopped. "I'm from the city, yes. My dad said a lady from the city has been coming here a lot. He didn't say why." Lily studied her with frank assessment. "You're pretty." "Thank you. My teacher is pretty too, but she's mean about it. Like she knows and she's annoyed. You don't seem annoyed." Charlotte sat down at the table across from her, which she suspected was either exactly the right move or exactly the wrong one. "What are you drawing?" Lily turned the napkin around. It was a mountain, rendered in careful purple pen, with what appeared to be a car on fire at the bottom. "It's the road where my dad fixes people's cars sometimes when they're stuck. I'm adding the drama." Charlotte looked at the burning car. "Good instinct." Lily seemed pleased by this. She pulled the napkin back and added a small figure to the scene, standing a safe distance from the fire with their arms crossed. "That's my dad. He's not worried because he knows what to do." Charlotte looked at the small figure, the arms crossed, the calm posture in front of the drama. "That's a good portrait," she said, and she meant it as more than a comment about the drawing, and some part of her wondered if the 8-year-old heard that, because Lily looked up again with her father's eyes and said, "He's the best person I know. I'm not just saying that because he's my dad. I've done the comparison." Charlotte laughed. It came out suddenly and genuinely, the kind of laugh that surprised you. Lily looked satisfied. Marta from behind the counter caught Charlotte's eye and gave her a look that communicated without words that she had just passed some kind of test she hadn't known she was taking. Ethan arrived 20 minutes later, coming through the door with the particular forward momentum of someone who'd already been working for 3 hours. He stopped when he saw them at the table together, and something moved across his face too quickly for Charlotte to fully read. Then he said to Lily, "Did you finish the worksheet?" "Most of it." "What's most of it?" "The hard ones are left." "That's the opposite of most." He pulled out the chair beside her and sat down. He looked at Charlotte. "She had a half day. I told her she could come here while I finished the valve cover job." "She's been good company," Lily said. "I told her you're the best person I know." Ethan looked at his daughter with an expression that was equal parts affection and mild exhaustion. "You can't just tell people that." "Why?" "Because—" He stopped. "Get the worksheet out." Lily produced the worksheet from under the napkin drawing without argument, which suggested this was a hill she'd already decided wasn't worth dying on today. She started on the remaining problems, occasionally asking her father questions that he answered without looking up from his coffee, the two of them working through it in a rhythm that was clearly established and comfortable and entirely natural. Charlotte sat across from them and drank her coffee and had the particular feeling of watching something real, not performed, not curated, not shaped for an audience. Just a father and his daughter at a table on a Thursday morning, working through a worksheet about fractions, in a coffee shop where the chairs didn't match, and the menu was handwritten and the coffee was, objectively, quite good. She thought, "I have to tell him." And then, almost immediately after, "I don't know how." She drove back to the city that afternoon with the mountain at her back, and the question still unresolved, and she sat with it all through November, all through the early gray weeks of December, while the situation she didn't yet know about was already building, already moving, in the offices of people she trusted, towards something that was going to make all of this much more complicated before it could become anything else. But that was still ahead. On this particular Thursday, in the last good light of a November afternoon, she had only the question and the drive and the mountains, and somewhere behind her a man was picking up his daughter's worksheet and probably arguing about dinner, and for reasons she hadn't fully explained to herself, that felt like more than it should. She was right about that. She just didn't know how right yet. December arrived in Silver Creek the way it always did. Not gradually, but all at once. The way a decision does when it's been building for a while, and finally just lands. One morning, the mountain above town was bare rock and brown pine, and the next it was white from the tree line up, and the temperature dropped 15 degrees in 2 days and stayed there. The garage got busier. Cold weather was hard on older vehicles, and most of the vehicles in Silver Creek were older. Ethan's bay was full from open to close most days, and he'd brought in a part-time help, a 19-year-old named Danny who was good with his hands and bad with paperwork, which meant Ethan was staying late most nights handling the administrative end after Danny went home. Charlotte noticed the later hours because she was paying attention. She'd stopped pretending to herself that she wasn't. She'd also spent 3 weeks attempting to verify what she believed she already knew, and the verification was proving harder than she expected. The university records from that period were not digitized in any accessible way. The hearing documents were sealed under student privacy policy. The lab monitor whose statement had saved her, a woman named Reyes, she remembered the name from the letterhead, had left the university years ago and was not findable through the usual channels. Charlotte had tasked her assistant with a quiet search, framed as background research for a philanthropy project, and the assistant had come back with nothing useful. What she had was a timeline that fit. A sophomore engineering student at State who had left mid-year to care for a sick parent. The right years, the right department, the right kind of quiet competence. A man who, when she'd asked him directly if he remembered her, had said no in a way that was technically a denial and obviously something else. She had the feeling, and she had the timeline, and she had the way he'd said it. That was not nothing. But it wasn't enough to say out loud. Not yet. Not to him. If she was wrong, she'd be telling a man she barely knew that she'd been building a theory about him for weeks, which was a strange thing to do. And if she was right, she hadn't fully worked out what happened if she was right. The debt she felt was enormous and old, and she had no idea what it looked like in the present tense said out loud in a garage in December, to a person who had apparently decided not to claim it. She kept coming back to Silver Creek. She stopped trying to justify it. The first Friday of December, she drove up in the early afternoon and found the shop closed. Not closed, just a handwritten sign on the door that said, "Back at 2, school pickup." And she was standing in the parking lot looking at this sign when a car pulled in behind her, and Lily got out of the passenger seat, backpack swinging, and stopped when she saw Charlotte. "Hi," Lily said. "Hi. Are you waiting for my dad? I was going to ask about my car, but it can wait." Lily studied her with the particular assessment of a child who has not yet learned to disguise evaluation as something polite. "You come here a lot. My car has a lot of problems. My dad says most problems with cars are just deferred maintenance." Lily said this in the tone of someone quoting something heard many times. Then she added, in her own voice, "I don't totally know what deferred means, but I think it means you kept ignoring it." Charlotte looked at her. "That's probably right." Ethan came around from the driver's side, already looking at Charlotte with the measured expression that had become familiar, the one that wasn't quite welcoming and wasn't quite not. "Didn't know you were coming today. I should have called." "It's fine." He unlocked the shop door and pushed it open. "What's the car doing?" "Nothing urgent. There's a noise when I accelerate on the incline. Started maybe 3 days ago." He glanced at Lily, who had already moved past them both and was settling herself at the small desk in the corner of the waiting area, where she apparently did homework on afternoons when school let out before the shop closed. She had a system. Backpack on the hook, worksheet out, pencil case open. She'd done this many times. Ethan said, "Give me 20 minutes. Charlotte sat in the waiting area while he pulled the car in. Lily worked on what appeared to be a social studies worksheet with the focused energy of someone who wanted to finish it before she got to whatever was more interesting. For a while, the only sounds were the scratch of Lily's pencil, the noise of Ethan moving around the car in the next bay, and the country station playing low from the shop radio. Then Lily said, without looking up, "Do you live alone?" Charlotte glanced at her. "I have an apartment in the city, yes." "Is it big?" "Medium. Big enough?" Lily considered this. "My dad says big apartments are lonely and small apartments are cozy. Ours is small." She paused. "I added the decoration so it's extra cozy. He wasn't going to put up anything, but I convinced him." "What kind of decorations?" Lily finally looked up, apparently pleased by the question. "Mostly drawings. Mine. Some are on the walls with that tape that doesn't ruin the paint. My dad is very serious about the tape. He said if we lose the deposit, it comes out of my college fund." She delivered this with no particular alarm, just reporting facts. "I also have some lights in my room, but they're mine, not the whole apartment." "What are the drawings of?" Lily turned fully around in the chair. "Lots of things. The shop, mountains. One of me and my dad at the county fair last summer. One of my friend Priya's dog because she was sad when the dog had surgery, and I gave it to her, and then her mom framed it, which was—" She stopped. "My dad said it was a generous thing to do, but I kind of wanted to keep it." "You can feel both things." Lily looked at her for a moment, and something settled in her expression that was older than 8. "Yeah," she said. "I know." Then she went back to her worksheet. Ethan found the noise, a heat shield that had come loose and was vibrating against the exhaust, and fixed it in under half an hour. The bill was low enough that Charlotte pushed back on it, and he gave her the same flat look he always gave her when she pushed back on bills, which communicated that the price was the price and the conversation was over. She paid it. She was getting her keys when Lily said from the desk, "Are you staying for dinner?" Charlotte stopped. Ethan stopped. There was a brief silence that had some weight to it. "Lily," Ethan said. "What? I'm just asking. You were going to make the soup." "That doesn't mean sit. It's enough soup." Lily turned to Charlotte with the directness of someone who had not yet learned that directness was complicated. "He makes this potato soup that's actually really good, even though it looks bad. He puts cheese on top." Charlotte looked at Ethan. Ethan was looking at his daughter with an expression that was trying to be firm and not entirely succeeding. She could see him deciding whether to shut this down. She could see the exact moment he decided not to, and the careful neutrality that came over his face after that decision. "You don't have to," he said to Charlotte. Not an invitation, not a refusal, just the truth of it. "I'd like to," Charlotte said, "if it's not a problem." "It's not a problem," Lily said immediately. "It's not," Ethan said 2 beats later, in a tone that suggested he was still running the numbers on whether this was a good idea. The apartment was above a hardware store 2 blocks from the shop, up a narrow staircase that turned once before it got there. 3 rooms plus a bathroom exactly as described, small, layered with evidence of the 2 people who lived in it. The kitchen was clean in the functional way of someone who cooked seriously but didn't have time for aesthetics. Good knives, practical cookware, a magnetic spice rack on the wall that was organized with a precision that was slightly at odds with the general cheerful disorder of the rest of the place. The disorder was mostly Lily's. Drawings taped to walls with the approved non-damaging tape. A bookshelf in the living room that held a mix of adult history books on the top 2 shelves and children's books spilling off the lower ones. A jacket on the back of the couch that was Lily's but appeared to have been there long enough to be considered furniture. A half-finished puzzle on the coffee table. Mountain landscape, sky, and trees mostly assembled. The harder middle section not yet started. Charlotte stood in the living room while Ethan started the soup and Lily disappeared into her room to change out of her school clothes, and she looked at the drawings on the walls. There were maybe a dozen of them. The shop, several times over, in different seasons to judge by the sky color in each. A mountain with a moon that was too large but purposeful, the size clearly a choice. 2 figures at what was recognizable as the Silver Creek County Fair. A Ferris wheel in the background, 1 figure tall and the other small, both holding what appeared to be corn dogs. She stood in front of this one for a long time. "She made that in September," Ethan said from the kitchen. He was cutting potatoes with the efficiency of someone who did it regularly. "Gave me the original for the shop and said she'd make a copy for home. It took her 4 tries to get the Ferris wheel right. It's good. She's been drawing since she could hold a marker. I had nothing to do with it." He said this with the same lack of decoration he applied to most things, but she could hear the thing underneath it, the specific pride that tried to stay out of its own way. "Gets it from her mother's side, probably. I can't draw a straight line." Charlotte turned away from the wall. "What's in the soup besides the potatoes?" "Leeks. Bacon, if I have it. Chicken stock, if I don't." He glanced at the fridge. "I have the bacon. Can I help?" He looked at her the way he looked at most direct offers, with the slight pause of someone who defaulted to handling things alone and was recalibrating. "You can chop the leeks if you want. Knife's in the block." She washed her hands and found the leeks in the crisper and started on them. They worked in the kitchen together without talking for a few minutes, just the sound of knives and the stock already warming in the pot. It was not uncomfortable. Charlotte had cooked alone for most of her adult life. Her apartment kitchen was well equipped because she was good at it, and she found it useful to have the skill, but it was mostly a solitary activity for her. This was different. The kitchen was small enough that they were near each other without being crowded, and Ethan moved with the easy competence of someone who knew exactly where everything was, and the whole thing had a kind of ordinary intimacy to it that Charlotte found harder to manage than the boardroom she spent most of her life in. Lily reappeared in the doorway in sweatpants and a t-shirt with a faded logo on it and said, "She's helping make dinner?" "She's chopping leeks," Ethan said. Lily studied this arrangement. "Okay," she said finally, apparently having run some internal analysis and reached a satisfactory conclusion. She climbed onto the counter stool at the kitchen island. Ethan made a noise of mild protest about this that she ignored with long practice, and opened a book, which was her apparent plan for the cooking portion of the evening. The soup was, as advertised, good. Better than good, actually. The kind of soup that a person makes when they've made it many times and know exactly what it needs and when. They ate at the kitchen table, the 3 of them, with Lily providing most of the conversation and Ethan and Charlotte supplying the straight man responses she needed to keep the stories going. Lily was telling them about a drama at school involving a science fair project, another student, and a disputed volcano. The details were intricate, and the injustice was clear to her even if the full picture was murkier. And Ethan listened with the patient attention of someone who had learned that the full story mattered even when it came out sideways. At one point, Lily said, "Charlotte, do you like science?" Charlotte said, "I studied engineering, So yes. Lily's eyes went wide. Like machines? Like systems. How things connect to each other and what happens when one part stops working. Lily thought about this. That's what my dad does too, except with actual cars. Ethan looked across the table at Charlotte, and for a moment something passed between them. Quiet, unplanned, the recognition of a thing neither of them had said. He looked away first, picked up his soup spoon. After dinner, Lily fell asleep on the couch during what was supposed to be 30 minutes of television before bed, with the speed and totality of a child who had run her day fully to the end. Ethan carried her to her room with the practiced ease of someone who had done this many times, and Charlotte stayed in the kitchen and did the dishes because it seemed like the thing to do. He came back and found her finishing the last pot. He leaned in the doorway and looked at her for a moment, and she could feel the weight of whatever he was about to say before he said it. "You're going to tell me something," she said, without turning around. A pause. "Maybe." She put the pot on the drying rack and dried her hands and turned around. He was still in the doorway, arms crossed, the expression from the road back again. The one that wasn't giving much but wasn't hiding that there was something to give. "I know who you are," he said. "Not just the name. I knew when I saw the registration, and I remembered more than I said at Marta's." Charlotte held very still. "I was in your department, spring semester, second year. I was in the lab the night you turned in that project. I saw you working on it. And when the accusation came out, I knew it was wrong because I'd watched you build the whole thing." He said it flatly, like he was checking items off a list. "So I talked to the lab monitor, and I pulled the keycard log from the department office. I knew the admin assistant. She let me look at the access records. And I put together what I could and submitted it to the hearing officer." The kitchen was very quiet. Charlotte said, "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I didn't know you. I just knew you hadn't done what they said you did." He unfolded his arms. "It wasn't a big thing. It was just the right thing. It was not a small thing." Her voice was level, but only barely. "Ethan, I was 21 hours from losing everything. The scholarship, the program. I had nothing to go back to. My family couldn't—" She stopped, steadied. "It was not a small thing." He looked at her. "I know," he said, quieter. "I know it wasn't. I didn't want anything from it. I wasn't doing it for a reason except that it was wrong. And then you left. My dad got sick that spring. I came home and the semester slipped, and then I just never— There was always something." He lifted one shoulder, dropped it. "It wasn't a plan to disappear. It was just how it went." Charlotte looked at him for a long moment. There was something she'd rehearsed in the weeks of waiting. A speech of some kind, a formal acknowledgement, something that matched the size of what she felt. None of it came. What came instead was something simpler and less managed. "I've been looking for you," she said. "Not recently. Years ago, right after. I tried to find out who did it. Nobody knew. I didn't tell anyone." "I know. That makes it worse somehow." She paused. "Or better. I don't know." He nodded slowly. He wasn't looking for her gratitude. She could see that plainly. It wasn't false modesty or performance. He genuinely didn't seem to need anything from this conversation. That was possibly the most disorienting thing about him. She said, "Is that why you didn't tell me? When you recognized my name?" He was quiet for a moment. "Partly, and partly—" He stopped. Then, more carefully, "I didn't want you to feel like you owed me something, because you don't. I didn't say I owed you. No, but people feel things like that, and I didn't want that to be—" He gestured vaguely at the kitchen, the apartment, the evening they'd just had. "Whatever this is, I didn't want it to be because of that." Charlotte looked at him, standing in the doorway of his small apartment kitchen in a mountain town, careful and plain-spoken and genuinely not interested in leverage. And she thought, this is the strangest man I have met in years. Not strange bad, strange like a thing that doesn't fit any category you already have. "What is this?" she asked. He looked at her directly. "I don't know yet." It was an honest answer. She took it as one. December moved forward. Charlotte reorganized her schedule in ways her executive team noticed without understanding. More remote days, fewer back-to-back city meetings, an interest in restructuring how the mountain property figured into her operational setup. She moved some of the technical infrastructure work to a contractor in Millhaven, 40 minutes from Silver Creek, which gave her a plausible professional reason to be in the region 2 or 3 days a week. She came to Silver Creek on those days, and on some of the other days too. She and Ethan did not define anything. This was partly because neither of them was in a hurry, and partly because the situation had enough genuine weight to it. His daughter, her position, the 15-year history sitting underneath every conversation like a foundation that neither of them fully understood yet, that naming it felt premature. They had dinner at the apartment twice more, both times with Lily present, both times easy in the way things are when they've found their own level. They went to the Saturday market in town one morning because Lily wanted apple cider donuts, and she'd decided Charlotte should come, and Ethan had raised no objection. They walked the market stalls, and Lily held Charlotte's hand at one point as they looked at a display of hand-carved wooden animals, with the casual ease of a child who makes these decisions without asking permission, and Ethan had seen it and said nothing. Charlotte called him one evening from the city, not about the car, just called, and they talked for 45 minutes about nothing particularly important, infrastructure history and mountain winters, and whether the puzzle on his coffee table was ever going to be finished. And she lay in her apartment afterward with the phone on her chest and looked at the ceiling and acknowledged to herself what had been true for several weeks. There were things she hadn't told him, the depth of what she owed him, not financially, not practically, but in the irreversible sense of a life that went one way instead of another. The full shape of what his evidence had made possible, the degree, the first job, the startup, the decade of work that had built Hayes Digital, all of it. She thought about this and could not figure out how to say it in a way that didn't make him the origin point of her story, which she suspected he would find uncomfortable for reasons that had nothing to do with ego. She also hadn't told him about the other thing. The thing she'd first noticed in mid-November when reviewing a subsidiary report that shouldn't have been in her standard folder. A real estate development filing cross-referenced with land parcels in Silver Creek. She'd flagged it and moved on because the quarter was busy and it had seemed like a minor irregularity, but she'd come back to it twice since, and the more she looked, the less minor it was. A corporation called Ridgeline Ventures LLC, land acquisition filings in 4 parcels along the county road at the south end of Silver Creek. Planning documents for a mixed-use resort development with a Phase 2 that included the main commercial corridor, which included the corner lot on Carpenter Street. She'd spent a week running the corporate structure of Ridgeline Ventures through her legal team's standard shell company analysis, which was a service she used several times a year for due diligence on acquisition targets. The chain was layered, 3 holding entities, 2 of them registered in Delaware, 1 in Nevada. But the ultimate beneficial owner, buried under the 3rd layer, was a man named Gerald Foss. Gerald Foss was the chair of her board of directors. She sat with this for 3 days before she fully understood what she was looking at. Foss had been on her board for 4 years, brought in by the previous ownership group when she'd taken on the institutional investors. He was competent, occasionally useful, and had never openly obstructed her. He had also apparently been quietly building a land position in Silver Creek for 18 months, using entities that were technically unconnected to Hayes Digital, but that she could now see had been partially financed through a series of management fee arrangements that ran through a subsidiary she'd authorized without examining closely enough. He was using her company's money, at one remove, to fund a development project that would displace the businesses on Carpenter Street in Kelsey, including the garage, and he had structured it to be invisible to her unless she went looking. She was looking now. She thought about telling Ethan immediately. She picked up the phone twice. Both times she put it down. Because she was still building the picture, and because she needed it to be complete before she walked into a situation she couldn't walk back from, and because there was a part of her, a part she wasn't proud of, but that was there, that wasn't ready to watch the easy December they'd been building together become something harder. She knew she was running out of time on that. The land acquisition filings she'd found were from 18 months ago. If Foss was moving toward the next phase, the pressure on the properties along that corridor would start to appear any day. Suppliers getting called, loan reviews getting triggered, small things at first that each looked like coincidence. She needed to be ready before that started. She wasn't quite ready yet. The last Saturday before Christmas, Lily had a school performance, a winter concert, the kind with folding chairs and a gymnasium that smelled like floor wax, and 30 children in various states of costume singing songs about snow with varying degrees of collective agreement about the melody. Ethan had mentioned it 2 weeks earlier, casually, in the context of explaining why he couldn't do a Saturday morning market run that week. Charlotte had put it in her calendar without mentioning it to him. She showed up at the gymnasium at 6:45. The folding chairs were mostly full. She found one near the back and sat in it and spotted Ethan 3 rows from the front, alone, with Lily's coat over the seat beside him, holding it for Lily, who was presumably backstage. He was wearing a flannel shirt that he'd clearly chosen as the dressy option and had a program in one hand and his phone in the other, probably checking on a shop thing, because he checked on shop things the way Charlotte checked on company things. Reflexively, without being able to fully turn it off even when the occasion argued for it. She sat in the back for most of the first half. Then, during the intermission, she moved up. He heard the chair scrape and turned and looked at her, and his expression went through 3 things in fast succession. Surprise, recalibration, something she couldn't quite name that resolved into something quieter. "You came," he said. "I heard there would be folding chairs and floor wax." There was a waiting list. "I have connections." He looked at her for a moment. Then he moved Lily's coat to his lap to make the seat available. Charlotte sat down. They didn't say anything else. The lights went down for the second half, and the 30 children filed back out in their various costumes, and Lily appeared in the 3rd row from the left in a silver headband that was not quite straight, scanning the audience with the efficient focus of a person with a specific mission. She found her father. She raised a hand in a small wave. Then her eyes moved, and she found Charlotte, and whatever expression she'd been holding shifted into something considerably brighter and less restrained, and she gave Charlotte a wave that was significantly larger than the one she'd given her father. Ethan, beside Charlotte, made a small sound that was not quite a laugh. "She saw you." "I noticed. She's going to talk about this for a week." "I can live with that." He looked sideways at her, just briefly, and she looked back, and neither of them said anything, and the music started again. 30 kids, folding chairs, gymnasium acoustics, a shared armrest they were both carefully not using, and it was not a grand moment. It was a small one, specific and ordinary and located in exactly the kind of life she had not thought she was building toward. She thought about Foss, about the filing, about the clock that was running on something she didn't fully control. She put it aside for now. For now, there was just this: a school concert in December, a man sitting 3 inches to her left, and a little girl in the 3rd row from the left, with a crooked silver headband who was singing slightly louder than everyone around her, and who had, apparently, already decided that Charlotte belonged here. Charlotte was not entirely sure that was wrong. The first sign came on a Tuesday in early January, 4 days after the new year, when Ethan's primary parts supplier called to say they were reviewing his account. Not canceling. Reviewing. That was the word the representative used, twice, in a tone that suggested the distinction was important to him professionally, even if it meant nothing practically. Ethan had been with Pacific Northwest Auto Parts for 6 years. He had a net 30 account, a clean payment history, and a volume arrangement that had taken 3 years to negotiate to where it was. A review made no sense. He asked why. The representative said it was a routine credit assessment triggered by a flag in their system, and he couldn't give more detail than that, and he was sorry for the inconvenience. Ethan hung up and stood in the shop for a moment, looking at nothing in particular, then went back to the brake job on the Tacoma in Bay 2. He was not an anxious person by nature. He'd learned early that anxiety about things you couldn't immediately address was mostly just wasted energy, so he was good at putting things in a holding category and coming back to them when he had more information. He put the supplier call in that category and kept working. 2 days later, the holding category got crowded. His business loan came up for its annual review 3 months early. The letter from the bank was careful and formal and explained that due to updated risk assessment protocols, they were conducting an expedited review of all small business accounts in certain sectors, and they would need updated financial documentation within 15 business days. He'd had the same loan officer for 4 years. He called her directly. She was apologetic and slightly uncomfortable in a way that people are when they're delivering a message they didn't write and don't fully understand. She said it was coming from their regional risk office. She said she was sure it would be fine. She said it in the voice of someone who wasn't sure at all. He told Charlotte about it that Thursday when she came up. He told her the way he told her most things, without dramatizing it, just the facts in sequence. They were in the shop, between jobs. Ethan with a coffee, and Charlotte leaning against the workbench in her city coat that she'd stopped apologizing for being impractical for a garage. She listened to both things, and her face went very still in the way he'd come to recognize as her thinking face. Not blankness, but the quality of attention that was almost physical, a narrowing of focus. Both in the same week, she said, 4 days apart. Same week, she said again, like she was filing something. Then, have you had any contact recently with anyone about the property? The shop or the lot? He looked at her. Why would I have contact about the property? She picked up her coffee cup and looked at it and put it down. Ethan, I need to tell you something, and I should have told you 2 weeks ago. He waited. She told him about the filing, about Ridgeline Ventures, about the land acquisition positions along the south corridor of Silver Creek going back 18 months. She told it in order clearly, without softening it or overstating it, the way she apparently told everything when she was being fully straight with someone. He let her finish. The shop was quiet except for the compressor. The corner lot, he said. Your lot is in the second phase acquisition documents, along with 4 other parcels on Carpenter Street and 2 more on the adjacent block. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, a truck went by on the street, slow, and the radio in the back office was playing something old and low. And you said the money behind it runs through your company. Through a subsidiary. Indirectly, but the trail is there. She paused. The man running it is Gerald Foss. He chairs my board. Ethan looked at the workbench. He had a wrench in his hand that he didn't remember picking up. He set it down. How long have you known? About Foss specifically? 3 weeks. About the land filing? Longer. She held his gaze. I was still building the picture, and I should have told you sooner. That was wrong. He didn't say it was fine because it wasn't entirely fine, and she wasn't asking him to say so. That was something he'd worked out about her over the past 2 months. She didn't soften things to get absolution. What does he want with the land? A resort development. The initial filings show a boutique mountain resort in Phase 1, with commercial mixed use in Phase 2 that runs along this corridor. It's a significant project, the kind that requires the existing businesses to be removed. She said that last sentence carefully, without inflection. Ethan sat down on the stool beside the workbench. He was thinking about his father. About the 22 years his father had run a shop on this corner lot, and the 6 years before that when it had been a different garage run by a man named Henley, who'd sold it to his father because he was getting old and wanted someone who'd keep it going. Nearly 3 decades of that corner lot being what it was. He was thinking about this without sentimentality. He was not a sentimental person, but with a kind of flat recognition of what the thing was worth. What happens if I just don't sell? He asked. He creates enough financial pressure that you can't hold on. Supplier reviews, loan flags, maybe a few contract customers finding reasons to go elsewhere. Nothing that's illegal on its face. It takes a while, but eventually the numbers don't work. How long? Depends on your reserves. 6 months. Maybe less if he escalates. Ethan looked at the floor of the garage bay. Clean concrete, oil stains from decades of work worn into the grain of it. And what are you planning to do about it? Everything I can. She said it without hesitation. But I need you to understand what that means. Confronting Foss directly, at the board level, possibly publicly, puts my position at risk. He has relationships with 4 of my 8 board members that predate me. If I come at him openly and I don't have the full picture locked down, he can move to remove me. And if he removes me, the investigation into the subsidiary stops. Ethan looked at her. So you're telling me the timeline depends on how solid your case is? Yes. And while you're building the case, the supplier review and the loan flag are already running? Yes. He was quiet again. She didn't fill the silence, which he appreciated. How long do you need? 2 weeks, 3 at most. I have a forensic accounting team I use for acquisitions. They're the best at what they do. I need them to complete the paper trail on the subsidiary funding before I go into the boardroom." He nodded. He was not happy about the 2 to 3 weeks, but he understood the logic of it, and the logic was sound. He had reserves, some, not a lot, but enough for a few months if he managed carefully. The supplier review was the more urgent problem. If Pacific Northwest put a hold on his account, he couldn't source parts at his current volume, which meant he'd have to turn down jobs, which meant his revenue dropped, which would then actually justify the loan flag. He said, "Tell me what you need from me. Keep the shop running normally. Don't contact the supplier or the bank differently than you normally would. And," she paused, "if anything else changes, tell me immediately. Don't put it in the holding category." He looked at her sharply. She met his eyes. "You do that," she said. "You get a piece of information that's uncomfortable and you file it away and come back to it later. I do the same thing, which is why I waited too long to tell you about the filing. We can't both do that with this." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he said, "Fair." He told Marta that Friday morning over the early coffee before the shop opened. He didn't tell her everything, not the part about Foss and Charlotte's board, which wasn't his to share, but he told her about the supplier review and the loan flag and the land development interest in the South Corridor. Marta listened with her hands flat on the counter and her jaw set. "The new resort interest," she said. "I've been hearing things. Tom Riley said someone came into his hardware store last month asking about his lease structure, said it was a real estate survey." "Who came in?" "Tom said he didn't get a card. Young guy, professional, asked general questions and left." Ethan filed this. "Don't say anything around town yet. I'm working on it." Marta looked at him. "You mean the city lady is working on it?" He didn't answer that directly. Marta nodded slowly, processing something. "She's not just a customer," she said. It wasn't a question. "No. I figured." She refilled his coffee. "Is she good people?" He thought about it honestly, which was the only way he thought about things. "Yeah," he said. "I think so." "Good enough," said Marta, and went back to the counter. Okay. The second week of January, 2 more things happened. The first was that one of his contract accounts, a local delivery company that brought him 6 to 8 vehicles a month for maintenance, called to say they were going to have to consolidate their mechanic contracts for budget reasons and would be reducing their volume with him by 70%. The operations manager who called sounded genuinely uncomfortable. He'd sent all his vehicles to Ethan for 3 years and had never mentioned budget issues before. Ethan thanked him professionally and hung up and sat in the truck outside the shop for 5 minutes, doing math in his head that he didn't like the result of. Then he called Charlotte. She picked up on the second ring. He told her. She said, "Okay, that's him moving faster than I expected. Hold on." He heard her on another call briefly, then she came back. "Are you free tonight?" "Lily has a thing until 7. I'll be there at 8. She arrived at 7:55 with her laptop bag and a folder of printed documents and a look on her face that he was starting to recognize as her operational mode. Whatever warmth and ease existed between them in the ordinary moments organized itself into something more focused and directed. She spread the documents on his kitchen table while Lily finished brushing her teeth in the bathroom, and when Lily came out and said goodnight, she hugged Charlotte, briefly, which she'd started doing sometime in December, with the matter-of-fact ease of a child who had decided the attachment was real and saw no reason to be subtle about it. Charlotte hugged her back, and then Ethan took Lily to her room and came back, and they worked at the kitchen table until almost midnight. The picture Charlotte had built was thorough. The subsidiary trail ran from a Hayes Digital Infrastructure Management fee through 2 holding companies into Ridgeline Ventures. The amounts were structured to stay under thresholds that would normally trigger board review. Not tiny, but carefully sized. It had the look of something planned by someone who knew the internal review process as well, which meant someone who had been on the board long enough to understand how things were monitored. "He's been on your board 4 years, Ethan said, and planning this for at least 18 months, which means he started planning it during his 3rd year. She pointed to a date on the filing. This initial land option was executed in June 2 years ago, which was... She pulled up another document. 3 months after we turned down a resort development proposal from a third-party group. I voted it down. Foss voted for it. Ethan looked at the date. So when the external deal fell through, he decided to run the same play himself. Using our capital, from the inside, through shell entities he controlled privately. She sat back. The legal exposure is significant. Breach of fiduciary duty, at minimum. Possibly fraud, depending on how the funding structure reads under securities law. Is that enough to stop him? It's enough to remove him. Whether it's enough to stop the development project depends on whether Ridgeline Ventures has independent funding beyond the Hayes digital money, and I don't have that answer yet. She looked at him squarely. I'm telling you that honestly. Even if I take Foss down, the land acquisition might continue under different ownership. But your company's money would be out of it. Yes. He nodded. He was working through the second thing that had happened in the second week of January, which he hadn't told her yet. He'd been sitting with it for 2 days, which was exactly what she'd told him not to do, and he knew that, which was part of why he hadn't done it. I had a visitor Tuesday, he said. She looked up. A man. Came in during business hours. Said he needed an estimate on his SUV. Spent about 20 minutes asking questions that weren't really about the SUV. Wanted to know if I owned the building or leased, what the lease terms were, whether I'd had any conversations with developers recently. Then asked, at the end, kind of casually, if I'd be interested in a fair market consultation on the property. Charlotte's expression had gone very still. What did he look like? 30-something, professional, didn't leave a card. Same person who talked to Tom Riley. Maybe. Ethan paused. I told him I wasn't interested and he left. But before he left, he said, and this is the part I've been thinking about, he said that properties in this corridor were going to see significant market changes in the near term, and that it was worth consulting with a lawyer about my position before those changes happened. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. That's a threat, Charlotte said. Not quite. Deniable. But yes. She stood up from the table and walked to the kitchen window and stood there for a moment looking out at the street. Her hands were at her sides, not moving, which he'd noticed was what she did when she was managing something internally. She went very still. I'm moving the timeline up, she said. I'm calling my forensic team tonight and I'm going to them directly in the morning. I need the documentation complete by end of next week. What if it's not complete by then? She turned around. Then I go into the boardroom with what I have and I make it hold. She said it the way he said things, not dramatically, just as the fact of the matter. I want you to know that whatever happens with my position, if Foss has the votes and he moves against me, the documentation I've assembled still goes to the securities regulator and the company's outside counsel. It doesn't depend on me staying in the chair. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. You already set that up. Last week. She sat back down. I'm not telling you that so you'll feel like you owe me something. I want you to know where things stand. He held her gaze. You know I didn't ask you to do any of this. I know. And I don't want you to lose your company over my garage. That's not how I'm looking at it. How are you looking at it? She was quiet for a moment, and he could see her deciding how honest to be, which was a thing he'd noticed she did. She had a gear between polished and fully open, and she usually operated in that gear, and occasionally she shifted out of it. I'm looking at it as something that's wrong, she said, and something I can do something about, and someone... She stopped, recalibrated, and someone I care about being on the receiving end of it. Those 3 things together make it not a complicated decision for me. He looked at her. She looked back, not looking away. And the kitchen was warm and the street outside was quiet, and Lily was asleep down the hall, and Ethan thought about something he'd believed since he was about 20 years old, that most complicated situations were actually only complicated if you were trying to protect something you should let go of. The rest of the time they were just hard, which was different. He said, Okay. You have the timeline you need. I'm not going to tell you how to run your company. She looked at him. Something shifted in her face briefly, and she said, Thank you. Don't thank me. Just win. The left corner of her mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Almost. That's generally my plan. The 3rd week of January was the longest week Ethan could remember in recent years, and he'd had some bad ones. Pacific Northwest Auto Parts suspended his account on Monday morning. Not a review anymore. A full suspension pending resolution of their credit assessment, which they estimated at 60 to 90 days. He spent 4 hours on Monday sourcing alternative parts at worse prices and longer lead times, which meant he had to push 3 jobs back by 2 days, which meant 3 customers rescheduling, which meant 2 of them going elsewhere. He did not call Charlotte to tell her. He handled it and made a note of it and kept the shop open. Tuesday was worse. A water heater in the apartment failed in the night, and he spent 40 minutes at midnight managing the damage and another 2 hours on the phone with the building manager the next morning, which was not a catastrophe, but which used time and energy he didn't have. Lily thought the whole thing was interesting rather than terrible, which was something, but she was tired at school Wednesday and her teacher sent a note about it, which made him feel guilty in the particular way that single parents feel guilty about things that weren't preventable. Wednesday afternoon, Danny quit. Not badly. The kid was good about it, gave 2 weeks' notice, and had a real reason, a full-time position at the Millhaven dealership with benefits, and Ethan couldn't argue with that. He shook Danny's hand and said he'd write him a reference. Then he looked at the Bay schedule for the next 2 weeks and recalculated the hours, which came out to a number that meant he'd be working 7 days. Charlotte called Wednesday night. He told her about Pacific Northwest. She said, "I know. My team found the connection. There's a consulting relationship between their regional credit manager and one of Foss's holding entities. It goes in the documentation." "Good." "Ethan," her voice shifted. "I'm sorry this week has been what it's been." "It's just a week." Still. He was in the kitchen, leaning on the counter, later than he should have been awake. Down the hall, Lily was asleep. The apartment was quiet. "How's your timeline?" he asked. "Friday. The documentation is complete Friday morning, and I'm requesting an emergency board session for Monday." A pause. "I'm going to need you to trust me through the weekend." "I trust you." She was quiet for a moment after that. Then, "How are you actually doing?" He thought about the honest answer, which took a few seconds. "I'm tired. I'm short-staffed and short on parts, and I've got a loan review hanging over me, and I sent 2 customers to a competitor today because I couldn't hold their schedule." He paused. "But the shop's still open, and Lily had a good enough week at school, and the water heater is fixed. So I'm okay." He meant it. Not in the way people said it when they didn't mean it, but in the actual sense. Not fine, not great, but level, functional, oriented. "Are you okay?" She laughed, very briefly. "I'm going into a boardroom Monday to accuse my board chair of securities fraud. Another pause. "I'm okay too. Same version of okay as you." "Good enough." "Yeah." He could hear her in her city apartment, probably at the desk she worked at late, the one she'd mentioned having in the corner of the bedroom. "Get some sleep." "You too." He meant it. Gut. Friday came, and the documentation was complete, and Charlotte sent an encrypted copy to outside counsel and to the securities regulator's confidential reporting portal, and the board session was called for Monday morning. She called Ethan Friday evening to tell him. He was closing up the shop, last bay empty, lights on in the office while he finished the week's paperwork. "Monday," he said, 9 a.m. She paused. "I may be unreachable for most of the day. I don't know how long the session will run." "Understood." He locked the parts cabinet and sat at the desk. "Charlotte." "Yeah." "Whatever happens in that room, you know that you've already done more than I asked for or expected." She was quiet for a moment. "That's not why I'm doing it." "I know. That's why I said it." Another silence. Longer. He let it run because that was what felt right. Then she said, "I'll call you when it's over." "I'll be here." He locked up the shop and walked the 2 blocks home in the January dark, his breath visible in the cold air, the street quiet in the way mountain towns went quiet after 8 on winter evenings. The apartment was warm, Lily asleep already, a drawing on the kitchen table that she'd left for him, a picture of the shop with a sign in the window that said "Open," and 2 figures in front of it, one tall and one small, and off to the side a third figure he hadn't seen before, female-shaped, with what appeared to be a briefcase, and a very bad attempt at wavy hair. He looked at the drawing for a long time. 3 figures. One tall, one small, one new. Lily had drawn this the way she drew everything, without overthinking it, without deciding whether it was the right thing to do, just putting down what she saw. Ethan folded the drawing carefully and put it in the drawer where he kept the ones that mattered, which was a specific drawer, and which was a habit he'd never fully been able to justify, except that some things needed to be kept. He went to bed. He set his alarm. He thought about a boardroom in the city where something was going to happen on Monday morning that he couldn't control or be present for, and he thought about the fact that a woman he'd known for 3 months was walking into that room carrying something heavy, and he thought about whether he was afraid. He decided he was afraid. That was honest. He was afraid of losing the shop, which was not just a business, but the thing he'd inherited and kept going and built his daughter's life around. He was afraid in a smaller way of what it would mean for the version of things that had been building between him and Charlotte if this went wrong. Not because he thought she would disappear, but because situations like this had a way of reshaping people in directions you couldn't predict. And he'd had enough reshaping in his life to be cautious about more. But underneath all of that, and steadier, was something else. Something he recognized from the times in his life when the decision had been clear, even though the circumstances were hard. He trusted her. Not blindly. He knew her well enough by now to know that trust should have evidence behind it, and it did. The way she worked, the way she told him hard things directly instead of managing them, the way she'd drawn up the regulatory filing as a backstop before he'd even known to ask for it. The evidence was there. He went to sleep. Monday was 3 days away. 3 days in January, in a mountain town, with the shop still open and the lights on, and a drawer with a drawing in it, and something waiting on the other side of the weekend that neither of them could fully see from here. The board met at 9 on Monday morning in the 32nd floor conference room of the Hayes Digital Building, the one with the long glass wall that looked out over the city skyline and the mountains beyond it on clear days. Today was not a clear day. The January sky was flat and white, the kind of white that meant snow was coming but hadn't decided when, and the mountains were completely gone behind it. Charlotte had been in that room for 100 meetings. She knew every chair, every angle of the table, which seat got the glare from the east window in summer, and which one had the bad speakerphone connection. She'd delivered bad news there, and good news there, and a lot of news that was simply complicated. She'd been challenged there, twice voted down, once formally censured by a 3-person subcommittee for a capital allocation decision that she'd made correctly and that they'd come around to 18 months later, after she'd been proven right. She was not afraid of that room. She walked into it at 8:52 with her legal counsel, a woman named Patricia Osei, who had worked with her for 3 years and who was, Charlotte had always felt, approximately as difficult to rattle as anyone she'd ever met. Patricia was carrying a document binder that was 2 inches thick and a laptop bag and an expression that communicated that she had done this before and was ready to do it again. Gerald Foss was already there. He was 61, silver-haired, the kind of man who wore his authority like a garment he'd been fitted for decades ago and had never needed to adjust. He was talking to 2 of the other board members when Charlotte entered, something easy and social, and he looked up when she came in and gave her a nod that was entirely normal, professional. The nod of a man who had no idea what was coming or had decided to perform not knowing as long as possible. Charlotte thought it was the latter. Foss was smart. He would have known something was wrong when she called the emergency session Friday afternoon. He'd had the weekend to prepare. The question was what preparation looked like for a man who believed he'd covered his tracks well enough. The other 5 board members filed in over the next few minutes. Charlotte knew where everyone stood, roughly. She'd spent part of Saturday working through the relationship math. Who owed what to whom, who would follow the evidence, and who would follow Foss if it came to a vote. She had 5 votes she was confident in, and 2 she wasn't. The 2 she wasn't were men named Hartwell and Byrne, who had been brought to the board through Foss's network, and who had, in 4 years, never once voted against him on anything substantive. 8 people around the table, Charlotte at one end, Foss at the other. She opened without preamble. I've called this emergency session to present evidence of a serious governance violation that involves a current board member and requires immediate action. She nodded to Patricia, who distributed the binder to each seat. What you have in front of you is a documented record of a scheme to use Hayes Digital subsidiary funds to finance a private real estate development project through a series of shell entities conducted without board disclosure or shareholder approval over a period of approximately 18 months. The room was quiet, the kind of quiet that happens when people are deciding what their face should be doing. Charlotte kept going. She laid it out in sequence: the subsidiary management fees, the Ridgeline Ventures ownership structure, the land acquisition positions in Silver Creek, the development filings, the beneficial ownership trail that led to Gerald Foss. She was precise and she was thorough, and she kept her voice level throughout, not because she wasn't angry, but because anger in that room would cost her the credibility she needed. Foss let her finish. He was good. She gave him that. He sat at his end of the table with his hands flat and his expression engaged rather than defensive. The posture of a man responding to a presentation rather than an accusation. When she stopped talking, he said, "That's a serious set of allegations." "It's a documented set of facts," Charlotte said. "Documentation that your own team compiled without independent verification. The same documentation has been submitted to outside counsel and to the securities regulator's confidential reporting portal as of Friday afternoon." She watched his expression. Something moved through it, very briefly, too controlled to read completely. "Outside counsel has opened a preliminary review. That process runs independently of what happens in this room." A board member named Sorensen, who was on Charlotte's side of the ledger, said, "Gerald, do you want to respond to the specific figures here?" Foss turned his hands over on the table, a slow, deliberate gesture. "I'd like my legal representation present before I respond to anything specific." "That's your right," Charlotte said, "but this board has an obligation to act on a fiduciary breach regardless of your legal timeline. What we're voting on today is removal for cause. Your legal process can run parallel." Hartwell, at Foss's left, said, "Charlotte, you're asking us to remove a board chair based on an internal investigation that is corroborated by external filing records, corporate registry documents, and banking transaction records that are public or obtainable by outside counsel." Patricia spoke for the first time evenly. "The documentation in your binder includes source citations for every claim. The Ridgeline Ventures filings are public record. The beneficial ownership registration is public record in Nevada. The subsidiary fee structure is in Hayes Digital's own accounting system. This is not an allegation. It's a paper trail." The room went silent again. Byrne and Hartwell exchanged a glance that Charlotte tracked. Foss said, "What do you want here, Charlotte?" She looked at him directly. "I want you removed from this board today. I want the subsidiary funding to Ridgeline Ventures frozen pending outside counsel's review. And I want a full audit of all management fee structures going back to the beginning of your tenure." Foss looked back at her for a long moment. He was calculating, she could see it, running the vote count the same way she had, assessing his position. "You have 5 votes, he said finally. It came out quietly, almost conversational. "I've been on this board 4 years. I know what you have." "Then you know this goes the way it goes." The damage to this company from a public accusation of this kind is less than the damage from a securities fraud proceeding that runs for 2 years with a sitting board member under investigation. She held his gaze. "You know that math. Don't pretend you don't." Another silence. Hartwell was looking at his binder. Byrne was looking at the table. Sorensen was watching Foss. Then Hartwell said, without looking up, "I'd like to see the source records on the beneficial ownership chain." Patricia turned to the page. Hartwell read it. He read the page after that. He closed the binder and looked at Foss and said, "Gerald, I can't vote against this." The room changed, not dramatically. No one moved or made a sound. But something in the quality of the air shifted, and Foss felt it. Charlotte saw it in his jaw. A tightening, slight, quickly controlled. Byrne said, "I need a 5-minute recess." Charlotte said, "Take 10. No, the vote was 7-1. Foss cast the 1, which was his right, and then he gathered his copy of the binder and his legal pad and his coffee cup, and he left the room without speaking to anyone. The door closed behind him with a perfectly ordinary click that seemed too small for the occasion. Charlotte sat in her chair and breathed. Sorensen said, "What do we need from outside counsel to freeze the subsidiary funds today?" Patricia has the draft resolution. It needs a board vote. They took 2 more votes in the next 30 minutes, the subsidiary freeze and the audit authorization. Both passed unanimously. Patricia coordinated with the company's outside counsel by phone from the hallway during the second vote. By 11:30 it was done, or as done as it could be in a single morning. There were months of legal process still ahead. The Ridgeline Ventures question. What happened to the land positions without the Hayes digital funding, whether other capital would fill the gap, was still open. Charlotte knew this. She had not promised Ethan a complete resolution today. She'd promised him what she could do, and she'd done it. At 11:45, alone in the conference room after everyone else had cleared out, she called him. He picked up on the second ring. She could hear the shop in the background. Cheese, compressor, radio, the specific acoustic of a working garage. It's done, she said. A pause. Done. He's off the board. The subsidiary funding is frozen as of today. Outside counsel and the regulator have the documentation and their processes run independently now. The land positions... She stopped. Ridgeline still holds those positions. The money we can stop. The existing land options are a different legal question, and I won't know the answer for a while. She heard him exhale, slow and quiet. But the financial pressure, the supplier, the loan, those were driven by Foss's interference. With him removed and the subsidiary frozen, the mechanism is gone. I'm having Patricia send letters to Pacific Northwest and your bank today, under the company letterhead, explaining that a former board officer acted outside his authority in any communications touching their accounts. It won't undo everything immediately, but it establishes the record. Okay. His voice was level. She couldn't read how he was feeling, which was normal for him. He processed things internally first, and only let them out when they'd been through whatever internal review process he ran everything through. Are you okay? She laughed slightly. I'm sitting alone in a conference room at the top of a building that I still run. So, yes. Your position is secure? 7-1 is secure, yes. Good. A pause. Charlotte. Yeah. Thank you. She sat in the chair by the window and looked at the white sky where the mountains should have been. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. I want to. His voice was straightforward, no performance in it. You went into a room today and did a hard thing to protect something that wasn't yours to protect. I want to say thank you for that. That's all. She pressed her lips together for a moment, looked at the window. Come see me this week. Bring Lily. She has school. Friday. Bring her Friday. I want to take you both to dinner somewhere that isn't Marta's. A beat. She's going to have opinions about the restaurant. I'm counting on it. She heard the quiet sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Friday, he said. We'll be there. She drove to Silver Creek that Friday in the late afternoon, with the week behind her that had been the hardest professional week she'd had in 2 years, and also, in some ways she hadn't fully sorted out, one of the clearer ones. The outside counsel's preliminary review was underway. The regulator had acknowledged receipt by receipt of the filing. The subsidiary freeze was in place. 3 things that had been wrong were now less wrong, which was not the same as fixed but was movement in the right direction. She pulled up in front of the shop at 4:45. The bay doors were still open, one car on the lift, the sound of work coming through. Lily was at Marta's, but Ethan had texted her. Charlotte walked the 2 blocks and came through the door, and Lily was at the counter, not the table, apparently having been made an informal assistant, carrying a napkin holder from one end of the counter to the other with great purpose. She looked up when Charlotte came in and put the napkin holder down in entirely the wrong location and came around the counter at a speed that was probably not Marta approved. Charlotte caught her, briefly, the hug fast and tight in the way of a child who decides to do something completely and then finishes it and moves on. My dad said you fixed the problem, Lily said. Charlotte looked at Marta, who had the expression of someone who had been carefully not listening. We worked on it together. He said you fixed it. Lily stated this with the finality of an 8-year-old closing a debate. He said you went into a big meeting and you fixed it. Something like that. Lily studied her. Was it scary? Charlotte thought about Gerald Foss sitting at the far end of the table. The silence. The vote. A little, she said, but worth it. Lily nodded seriously. My dad says worth it is the whole point. Marta set a coffee on the counter and said, sit down, with the tone of a woman issuing instructions she expected to be followed, and Charlotte sat down, and the afternoon settled around them in the easy way of a place that had grown familiar. Lily went back to the napkin holder project, correcting its position to something Marta had not asked for but did not argue with. The street outside was winter gray, a few flakes coming down now, the first real snow of the year finally deciding to happen. Ethan came in at 5:30. He was still in his work clothes, jacket on against the cold, and he stopped when he came through the door and looked at Charlotte at the counter and Lily beside her explaining something at length. And his expression did the thing it sometimes did, that brief open moment before it settled back into its usual register. He sat down on the other side of Charlotte. Marta put a coffee in front of him without being asked. He said to Charlotte, quietly enough that Lily's narrative didn't require interruption, "How are you actually doing?" She looked at him sideways. "You asked me that Monday. Monday, you just left the boardroom. That's not the same as a week later." She thought about it honestly. The honest answer was that she was tired in a way that wasn't physical, the kind of tired that came from sustained alertness over a long period, the kind that didn't fix itself with sleep. She was also aware that something in her operating mode had shifted in the past 6 weeks in a way she hadn't fully accounted for yet. Her decisions had been different. She'd been running a parallel track the whole time, keeping the Foss situation alive alongside her normal operation, and it had cost something she didn't have a word for. "I'm tired," she said. "The good kind, mostly. Mostly. I'm also... I don't know how to say this without it sounding more dramatic than it is, but I've been running my company by myself for a long time, making every call alone. And this situation, having someone else actually in it with me, even from here, even by phone," she stopped. "It was different." He was quiet, looking at his coffee cup. "I'm not trying to make that into something it isn't," she said. "I just wanted you to know that it mattered." He looked up. "It mattered on this end, too," he said simply. Lily said, from slightly down the counter, "Are you two having a serious conversation?" "Yes," Charlotte said. "Should I leave?" "No." Lily considered this policy and apparently found it acceptable. She went back to her project. Dinner was at the new place that had opened on Millhaven Road, the one that had been a diner before and still had some diner DNA. The counter was original, the booths were original, but the kitchen had changed and the menu had changed, and the result was something that worked better than it had any right to. Lily ordered the grilled cheese, which she said was a meal she took seriously enough to order it everywhere because it was a test of whether a kitchen knew what it was doing. Ethan ordered the short rib. Charlotte ordered the salmon. Lily's grilled cheese arrived, and she ate 2 bites and said, "It's good. They used the right bread." She said this as a final ruling and then went back to telling them about a project at school that involved mapping the town's historical buildings, which she had opinions about that were, as usual, specific and detailed and harder to argue with than they probably should have been. Ethan watched his daughter across the table and said very little, eating his short rib and occasionally moderating when Lily's enthusiasm required it. Charlotte watched them both and felt something she'd felt before in this configuration. The sense of a life that was already assembled, functional, real, with its own rhythms and its own logic, into which she was being slowly and carefully admitted. It was not the same as being needed. It was something more and less than that. It was being wanted, which was different, and which she had less practice with. At one point, Lily looked at Charlotte and said, "Are you going to come up here more?" Charlotte glanced at Ethan, who was looking at his plate with the elaborate neutrality of a man who was not going to answer this question on his daughter's behalf. "I'm working on that," Charlotte said. "I'm looking at moving some of my work closer to this area. So yes, more." "Good," Lily said, "because my dad is less weird when you're around." Ethan said, "I'm not weird." "You are a little," Lily said, not unkindly. "You get quiet and you just stand in the kitchen. Charlotte comes and you make soup." Charlotte pressed her lips together hard. Ethan looked at his daughter with an expression that was failing to be stern. "I make soup regardless," he said. "Not as good," Lily said. The conversation moved on, but Charlotte sat with what Lily had said in the easy, uncomplicated way she said most things. And she thought about a man alone in a small apartment kitchen, standing in the quiet. And she thought about what it took to build a life that worked and hold it together for years by yourself, and still have the capacity to let something new into it. That wasn't nothing. That was actually quite a lot. After dinner, walking back to the cars in the light snow that was still coming down, Lily walked ahead of them with her hood up, catching snowflakes on her coat sleeve and examining them with great focus. Ethan and Charlotte walked behind her. He said, "I'm going to need a new parts supplier relationship. I've been putting together a short list. I know someone at Cascade Auto Supply in Millhaven. I'll introduce you if you want." "That would help." A pause. "I'm not asking you to fix everything. I know you're not. I just mean, I want to be clear about that. I'm not—" He stopped, and she could hear him working out how to say something he'd been thinking about. "The past month has been a lot of things landing at once, and you've been in it with me, which I appreciate, genuinely. But I don't want you to think that's what this is. Another stop. He was not a man who stumbled over words often, and the stumbling said something. "What I want from you isn't help. I just want you. The rest is just circumstance." Charlotte kept walking. The snow was quiet around them. The street lit in the way mountain town streets were lit in winter, pools of yellow light with dark between them. Lily was still ahead, examining her sleeve. "I know that," Charlotte said. "I know the difference." He looked at her sideways. She looked back. "I'm not here because I owe you something either," she said. "We've been clear on that for a while." "Yeah. So, he said. It was not a declaration. It was not a scene. It was two people walking through light snow on a winter street, having said something true out loud and then keeping walking. The drama was in the fact of it, not the delivery. That was the right way for it to happen between people like them, who both had the habit of meaning what they said and not much tolerance for extra. Lily turned around and said, "Are you walking slow on purpose?" "Yes," Ethan said. She turned back around and kept going, apparently satisfied with this answer. February came, and with it the outside counsel's preliminary report, which was not a light document. The summary confirmed everything Charlotte's team had documented and added 3 additional findings that her forensic accountants hadn't caught. Smaller in scale, but consistent with the pattern, things Foss had been running even longer than the 18 months she'd identified. The report went to the securities regulator, and the regulator opened a formal investigation. This was not public information yet, but it would be. Charlotte prepared her board and her executive team. She wrote the statement herself, brief, factual, not apologetic, which was the right tone for a company that had identified and reported the problem rather than concealed it. She sent it to her communications team for review. They suggested softening 2 sentences. She changed one of the 2, which was as much concession as she thought the situation warranted, and they went with that. The story broke on a Tuesday morning via a financial news service that had apparently received the regulatory filing through a public records request. By 10 a.m., it had been picked up by 3 major business outlets, and Charlotte's phone was operating at a volume that required her to turn notifications off and route everything through her assistant. By noon, the stock had dipped 4%, which was a reaction she'd modeled for and which she'd told her board to expect, and which, she'd explained, was considerably better than what would have happened if this had come out through a court filing rather than a voluntary disclosure. She was right about that. By end of week, the stock had recovered 2 of the 4%. The recovery was credited in one analysis to what the analyst described as unusually proactive governance response from the CEO, which Charlotte read once and then put away because she wasn't running the company for analysts. She called Ethan that Tuesday evening, after the day had finally slowed down enough to make a conversation possible. "It's public," she said. "I saw." A pause. "You okay?" "I will be. It's going to be a loud couple of weeks." "Your position?" "Secure. Sorensen is acting chair until we identify a replacement. He's solid." She moved around her office, phone in hand. "How's the shop?" "Pacific Northwest reinstated my account Monday. The bank sent a letter, standard language, the loan review is closed." "Good." She let out a breath. "Good." "Hey," he said. "Yeah. You did the right thing." She looked at the city through her office window, the evening lights coming on as the day darkened. "I know. Some things you do knowing they're right, and they still cost you something. That's allowed to be hard." She was quiet for a moment. She thought about telling him she was fine, which was her default setting, which she'd been running on for long enough that it was mostly automatic. She didn't say it. "It's a little hard," she said instead. "Mostly, I'm okay, but it's a little hard." "Okay," he said. Just that. Not a fix, not reassurance, just the acknowledgement of a true thing. "Lily has a thing Saturday," she said, "the school art show." "Yeah, she's been working on her submission for 3 weeks. It's a mountain landscape. She's been very serious about it. Can I come?" She heard the quiet that was his equivalent of a smile. "She'll be upset if you don't." "I'll be there at 10. She'll want you to stand next to her when they judge it." Obviously. The line was quiet for a moment, both of them just present in it, the city at one end and the mountains at the other, the winter between them already beginning to soften at the edges. "Charlotte," he said. "Yeah." "Come up sooner than Saturday." She looked at the window, the lights of the city, the white-gray sky beyond them where the mountains were. "Wednesday," she said. "I'll make the soup. I'll bring the leeks." He said, "Drive safe," and meant it the way he always meant it, plain and actual, not a formula. And she said she would, and she meant that too. She came up Wednesday as promised, with leeks in a paper bag on the passenger seat and a conference call running through the car speakers that she ended firmly at the county highway because she'd made herself a rule about that stretch of road. When the mountains came into view, the call stopped. It was a small rule. She'd been keeping it for 2 months now, which was longer than she'd kept a lot of rules she'd made for herself. The shop was busy when she pulled in. Both bays occupied, Danny's replacement, a woman in her mid-20s named Rosa, who had shown up in February with a resume and a manner that suggested she'd argue with you if you were wrong and be right about it, was under the Subaru in Bay 2, and Ethan was at the parts counter on the phone, the working kind of phone call, the kind where he was mostly listening and occasionally saying one word. He saw Charlotte come in and lifted his chin in acknowledgement, which was his version of a greeting when his hands were full, and she went through to the waiting area and put the leeks in the small refrigerator he kept there for lunches, and got herself a water and sat down to work on the restructuring proposal that was going to occupy most of her week. This was what it looked like now. Not romantic in the way people meant when they said romantic, not grand gestures and uninterrupted attention, but something that functioned like a life. She came up and she worked and he worked and they occupied the same space without performing it. And it was the most normal thing she'd had in years, and she was still slightly surprised by how much she'd needed something normal. The Ridgeline Ventures situation had resolved in late February, slower and less cleanly than she'd wanted. The securities regulator's investigation had resulted in Foss disgorging the Hayes digital funds, plus interest and penalties, which addressed the financing question. But Ridgeline Ventures itself, the land positions, the development filing, had survived on private capital that Foss had apparently arranged independently as a parallel track. He'd been smarter about the separation than she'd given him credit for, and for about 3 weeks in February she'd gone to sleep every night with the specific tension of a problem that was only half solved. The answer had come from an unexpected direction. Patricia, her legal counsel, had pulled the original land option agreements that Ridgeline held on the Silver Creek parcels and found something in the fine print that Foss's lawyers had apparently not flagged as a risk. 2 of the 5 parcels in the second phase, including the corner lot on Carpenter Street, had a right of first refusal clause that predated the Ridgeline option by 11 years. The clause was in an old lease agreement between the original property owner and the tenant at the time. The tenant had been Ethan's father. The clause had passed to Ethan when he inherited the business. It meant that any sale of that land required Ethan to be offered the opportunity to purchase it at the same price before any third party could proceed. Ridgeline couldn't force a development that required his parcel without either buying it from him directly, which he could simply decline, or going through a condemnation process that would require local government approval, which in a town the size of Silver Creek, with the community relationships that existed there, was not a realistic path. When Charlotte called to tell him, she'd said, "Your father put that clause in 11 years ago. Did you know?" A long pause. "No," he said. "I didn't know. He was protecting the shop, even then." Another silence. Longer. She didn't fill it. After a while he said, "Yeah," and his voice was different for just that moment, and then it wasn't anymore. Ridgeline Ventures had withdrawn the Silver Creek development application in March. The filing was quiet, a standard administrative withdrawal, no press release. Marta had called Ethan when she saw it in the county planning records and had said, according to Ethan, approximately 6 words and then hung up, which was Marta's style. The corner lot on Carpenter Street was still his. By April, Silver Creek had shaken off winter in the incremental way mountain towns did. Not all at once, but in sections. The south-facing slopes clearing first, then the main street, then the side roads, and finally the shaded spots along the creek where snow stayed the longest, as if it had a personal attachment to the ground there. The shop was busy in the way it got busy in spring, people bringing in vehicles that had been through a hard winter and needed assessment, and Ethan was working close to full capacity most weeks. Rosa had turned out to be as good as advertised, and her presence meant he wasn't doing 7-day weeks anymore, which had changed his face in a way that Charlotte noticed without saying so directly. She had restructured part of her operations in March, which she'd presented to her board as an efficiency initiative, and which was both that and something else she didn't put in the board presentation. A technical project management function that had previously been centralized in the city office moved to a distributed model with a regional hub contracted out of Millhaven. Her own schedule reorganized around the change, which meant 3 days a week in the city, 2 days remote, and 2 days that she classified as flexible, which in practice meant she was in Silver Creek by Thursday morning and stayed through the weekend. She'd rented a place, a small house on the edge of town, not the mountain property which was too far up the 14 for convenience, but a proper house with a kitchen and a yard and a shed she had no immediate use for. It was the first time she'd rented a place in Silver Creek, and the whole town knew about it within approximately 48 hours, which was a property of small town she'd accepted. Marta had said, "About time," when Charlotte mentioned it, which was generous given that Charlotte had known the woman for 5 months. She was not naive about the adjustment. Moving yourself toward a person's life, even incrementally, even with their knowledge and consent, was not simple. And she'd had honest conversations with Ethan about it that were not entirely comfortable. He was careful with her in that department, the same way he was careful with most things that mattered. He didn't want her making decisions about her life around his circumstances, and he said so plainly, more than once. The conversation that settled it had happened in February, on his couch, after Lily was asleep, the television off, and the apartment quiet. She'd said, "I want you to stop worrying about me making bad decisions on your behalf." He'd said, "I'm not worried about bad decisions. I'm worried about decisions that look good now and cost you something you didn't account for later. What do you think I'm not accounting for?" He'd been quiet for a moment. "Lily," he said finally. She'd looked at him. "She's already attached to you," he said. "She's been attached since December, and I'm glad about that. She doesn't have a lot of people, and I want her to have people. But if things between us don't work out the way—" He stopped. "I don't have a backup plan for how she handles that." Charlotte had sat with this. It was not a deflection, and it was not about protecting himself, and she knew the difference. It was the specific fear of a parent who had been the only constant in his child's life for 6 years, and who was now watching his child build an attachment to a new person and was running the risk calculation he was always running, the one that never fully turned off. She'd said, "I'm not going anywhere." "You can't promise that." "I know I can't prove it in advance, but I'm telling you, the way I can tell you anything true, that I'm not treating this as a temporary thing, and I'm not making decisions that are reversible by design. I'm making decisions that go in one direction." She'd held his gaze. "You have to decide if you trust that." He'd looked at her for a long time, the kind of look he gave things that he was taking seriously. Then, "I trust it." It wasn't the last hard conversation. There were others, about money, which was different for the two of them in ways that required honest negotiation. About her schedule, which didn't become simple just because she'd restructured it. About the times when she was operating in full CEO mode, and he was operating in full I-run-a-small-business-alone mode, and the gears of those two things ground slightly against each other. They'd had an argument in March that was genuinely an argument, sharp, uncomfortable, both of them saying things that were pointed, over something that started as a logistical disagreement and turned out to be about something older and harder. They'd worked through it over 2 days, and afterward it was better, and Charlotte thought, This is what it actually looks like. Not frictionless. Worked through. The art show had been in February. Lily's mountain landscape had taken third place in her age category, which Lily had received with complicated feelings, proud of placing, privately unconvinced about third, and Charlotte had stood next to her at the judging as promised, and afterward taken her out for hot chocolate and listened to a thorough analysis of the judging criteria that was both slightly unreasonable and also not entirely wrong. Ethan had listened to this same analysis twice before and made the face of a man exercising patience, and Charlotte had listened with genuine interest, and Lily had eventually talked herself through to the conclusion that third was good and she'd do better next year, which was probably the conclusion she needed to reach under her own power. By April, Lily had accepted Charlotte's presence in the way that children accept things that have become part of the normal, completely and without ceremony, as if it had always been this way and she didn't know why anyone would find it worth noting. She showed Charlotte her drawings without being asked. She reported school events to her with the assumption that Charlotte would find them relevant. When she was upset about something, she didn't always go to Ethan first anymore. Sometimes she came to Charlotte, and sometimes she came to both of them, and the specific way she moved between them had the logic of a child who had figured out who was good for what. Ethan watched this and said nothing, but Charlotte saw it in him, the gradual release of a held breath that had been running for months. One Saturday in April, she was in the yard of the rented house doing something she almost never did, which was nothing, sitting in a folding chair with a coffee that had gone cold, looking at the mountains which were showing their first real green on the lower slopes, while the peaks were still white. Her phone was inside. She'd left it there on purpose. She was thinking about her father, which she didn't do often. He died when she was 16, quietly and quickly, a fact that had restructured everything that came after it. She'd been thinking lately about what he would have made of all this. The company, the town, the garage, the man and the girl 2 blocks away. She didn't have an answer because she didn't know him well enough. 16 years was not enough to really know a parent, she thought, not the full version of them, but she thought he would have approved of the folding chair. He'd been a man who thought sitting still had value that busy people underestimated. She heard the gate before she heard them. Lily came through first, backpack on her back on a Saturday, for reasons that were probably drawing-related, followed by Ethan with 2 cups from Marta's, which he did sometimes on weekend mornings when she didn't come down to town. He handed her one of the cups without making it a production and sat down on the porch step with his own. Lily put her backpack down and opened it and got her sketch pad out and settled herself cross-legged on the grass. The yard wasn't much, a rectangle of spring-recovering lawn, a fence that needed 1 board replaced on the west side, the shed, but the mountains were visible over the rooftops to the north, and the morning light on them was worth sitting with. "What are you drawing?" Charlotte asked. "This," Lily said, gesturing broadly at everything. "Everything?" "The yard and the mountains and you and my dad." She was already sketching, the focus dropping over her face like a shutter. "I do documentation sometimes." Ethan looked at Charlotte over his coffee cup. Charlotte looked back. The word documentation, coming from an 8-year-old with complete seriousness, was not something you argued with. "Don't move too much," Lily said without looking up. They sat still. The morning went on. The coffee was good, and the mountains were doing what they did in April light, and Lily drew with the focused silence of a person engaged in something real, and Charlotte sat in her folding chair in her rented yard and thought that this was a thing she had not built toward, had not planned for, had not put in any operational framework she'd ever designed. It had come from a broken car on a mountain road and a bad storm, and a man who stopped because someone needed help and asked nothing for it. It had come from a piece of evidence submitted to a hearing 15 years ago by someone who walked away before she could say thank you. It had come from a drawer full of drawings and a soup that looked worse than it tasted, and a school concert in December with folding chairs and floor wax, and an 8-year-old who had decided Charlotte belonged here before Charlotte had decided it herself. She thought, the things that actually change your life almost never announce themselves. They arrive looking like something else. A broken car, a stopped truck, a voice on the phone, talking to someone you love. The Silver Creek Winter Festival had been running for 30 years, which was long enough that most people in town had stopped noticing it and just moved through it the way you moved through things that were part of the furniture of where you lived. It happened the second weekend of December, which put it exactly at the 1-year mark of the night Charlotte's Range Rover had died on the mountain road. She'd been aware of the date. She didn't say anything about it, because calling attention to anniversaries of things was not her habit, but she was aware of it. 1 year. She thought about the woman who had sat in that car in the rain with a dead phone and a flooded feeling of having made a small tactical error that had turned into something she didn't have a name for yet. She thought about that woman with a kind of affectionate distance, the way you look at an earlier version of yourself that was doing its best with what it had. The festival took over the main square and the 2 blocks of Main Street on either side of it. There were vendors and a skating rink that was never quite cold enough to be safe, and a stage at the north end of the square where local acts performed through the afternoon and a community address happened in the evening. Marta ran a booth every year. The hardware store had a display. The school had a craft table. Ethan opened the shop for the morning and closed it at noon because the festival made parking on Carpenter Street impossible and he'd given up fighting it years ago. They spent the afternoon together, the 3 of them, in the comfortable way they'd been spending days together since spring. Lily had opinions about every booth and exercised them thoroughly. Ethan bought her a kettle corn that she shared without being asked, which Charlotte took as a sign of genuine happiness because Lily shared kettle corn only under specific conditions. They ran into Marta, who gave Charlotte a look that communicated several things without words. Approval. Something like relief. Something like I told you so without having told her anything. They ran into Tom Riley from the hardware store, whose shop was now in no danger from Ridgeline Ventures, and who shook Charlotte's hand with both of his in a way that embarrassed her because she hadn't done it for him, not directly. But he thought she had, and she didn't know how to correct the accounting without making it complicated. The light started going at 4, the way winter light did, dropping fast once it decided to go. The temperature dropped with it. People moved toward the square for the evening stage, breath visible, kids in hats, the string lights coming on along the storefronts and across the square in a pattern someone had probably spent 2 days hanging and that Lily stopped to assess critically before pronouncing it good. The community address was a tradition. Whoever ran the local business association spoke for a few minutes. Then there were acknowledgments, then usually music. This year the association president was Tom Riley, who was 2 years into the role and was good at it in the way of a man who genuinely liked the town and didn't need the position to tell him so. Charlotte was standing with Ethan toward the back of the gathered crowd, Lily in front of them having worked her way toward the stage with the specific momentum of a small person who knew how to move through adults without asking permission, when she noticed something different. Tom at the microphone, after the usual remarks, was looking toward them specifically, toward Ethan specifically, with an expression that had something prepared in it. She glanced at Ethan. His jaw had a quality she'd seen before, the forward set of a person who knows something is coming and is holding themselves steady for it. This year, Tom said into the microphone, has been a reminder that this town is worth fighting for. Some of us had to do that more literally than others. He paused. Ethan Brooks has had his shop on Carpenter Street for 7 years. His father had a shop on that same corner for 22 years before that. That's close to 30 years of Brooks' family on that corner, and it's going to stay that way. I want to say that publicly because it matters. There was applause from the crowd, the genuine kind, not the polite kind. Charlotte felt Ethan beside her take a breath and let it out slowly. Several people turned to find him and nod. He nodded back, uncomfortable with the attention but not ungrateful for what was behind it. Tom said a few more things and stepped back, and the music started, and the crowd moved and redistributed. Lily had reappeared at Ethan's side, apparently having made her stage assessment, and returned. She looked up at her father and said, "They clapped for you. I heard. Was it good?" "Yeah," he said. "It was good." She slipped her hand into his with the ease of long habit, and he closed his hand around hers. And the 3 of them stood in the square with the snow coming down lightly, and the string lights doing their best, and the crowd moving around them. And Charlotte thought, I want this. Not more than this. Not a grander version of this. Exactly this. She had not fully known that until just now. That was its own kind of answer. An hour later, Ethan said he had something to show her. This was not how he said most things, which were direct. This had a care to it that was different. Lily, beside him, had an expression that was working very hard at being neutral and not entirely succeeding. He led them off the main square and down Carpenter Street, and Charlotte understood where they were going when she saw the light. Not the shop, not the Bayside, but the building directly adjacent to the shop, the one that had been vacant since she'd first come to Silver Creek. A 2-story brick building with a boarded lower window and a faded for-lease sign that had been there so long it had stopped meaning anything. The boards were gone from the window. The window was lit from inside. New glass in the frame, clean, the interior visible through it. She stopped. The space inside had been gutted and rebuilt. She could see it through the window in the stages, refinished floors, painted walls, bookshelves along the east wall, tables spaced in the middle of the room, a smaller room visible through an interior doorway, a projector screen on the far wall folded up, a long work table near the window with outlets mounted in the surface. It was not quite finished. There were boxes still in one corner, a ladder against the far wall, paint tape on the window trim, but the shape of it was clear. "What is this?" Charlotte said. Not a question exactly. "It was going to be the second phase of the development," Ethan said. "Ridgeline had the option on this building too. When they withdrew, I had the right of first refusal, same clause. I bought it in March." He paused. "I've been working on it since." "You've been working on it since March?" She turned to look at him. "You didn't say anything." "I wanted to see if I could do it first." He looked at the building, not her, with the particular expression of someone who had put a lot of himself into something and was now in the exposed position of having it seen. "You talked about it once. In November, early, I don't remember exactly what you said. You said something about how towns like this needed places where learning wasn't tied to whether you could afford to drive to the city, where kids could work on things outside of school, adults too." He paused. I remembered it. Charlotte stared at the window. "It's not done," he said. "I don't have the programming figured out or the nonprofit structure. I've been talking to someone in Millhaven about the legal setup. And I need equipment. The projector needs a proper mount. The smaller room needs—" "Ethan." He stopped. "Look at me." He looked at her. She didn't have a speech. She had thought about him for a year, since the rain, since the dark road, since the temporary hose, and the drive back down the mountain, and the sleepless night with the laptop. She had thought about him through the board meeting and the hard weeks and the legal process and the spring and the summer and all the ordinary Thursdays in between. She had thought she knew what this was. She did know what this was. But standing in front of a window that he had built from a piece of something she'd said in November, a piece she hadn't remembered saying, she felt the full weight of it in a way that the knowing hadn't prepared her for. He had renovated a building, with his hands, in the hours after the shop closed, around his daughter's schedule and his own. He had taken a vacant space that a corrupt development project had tried to take from the town, and he had turned it into something the town needed. He had remembered a sentence she'd said months ago and built it into something real. Lily said, very quietly for Lily, "Do you like it?" Charlotte looked at her. The girl was watching her with her father's eyes and her own expressiveness and a hope that she wasn't entirely hiding. "I love it," Charlotte said, and her voice was different than usual. Lily nodded, satisfied, like something had been confirmed. Then she looked at her father. Ethan reached into the pocket of his jacket. He'd been thinking about this for weeks. Not the speech, because he didn't have one and wouldn't have trusted himself to deliver one, but the thing itself, the fact of it. He'd been thinking about what it meant to invite someone into a life that was already assembled and real, not a beginning, but a middle, with a kid in a garage and a small apartment and a drawer full of drawings. He'd been thinking about the kind of woman who walked into that life and didn't try to renovate it, who sat in the waiting area and worked on her laptop while he finished a job, who argued with him honestly and came back after, who stood next to an 8-year-old at a school art show and listened to a critique of the judging criteria with genuine interest. He was not a man who did things he didn't mean. He had not meant to stop on that road a year ago for any reason except that someone needed help. He had not meant for any of the rest of it, and then it had happened. And he'd learned again what he'd first learned when Lily was born, that the things you don't mean to do are sometimes the truest ones, because they come from somewhere below the part of you that plans. He got down on one knee on the sidewalk in front of the building he'd built, in the light snow, with his daughter standing 3 feet away, barely containing herself, and he held up a ring that was simple and specific and nothing like what the magazines showed. He said, "I'm not good at speeches, you know that." Charlotte's hand was over her mouth. "I know what you gave up to walk into that boardroom, and I know you'd tell me you didn't give up anything, that it was the right thing, and I know that's true. But I also know what it cost." He held her gaze. "I want to spend a long time making that worth it, and I want Lily to have what she's already decided she has." Lily said, "I decided a long time ago." Clearly, she couldn't help it. "Lily," he said. "Sorry." Charlotte was laughing, wet-eyed, her hand still at her mouth, and she looked at Ethan and she thought about all the ways she could have not been here. All the forks in all the years where a different choice would have sent her somewhere else entirely, some other city, some other boardroom, some other version of a life that worked on paper. She thought about a hearing room 15 years ago and a set of documents submitted by someone who didn't leave a name. She thought about a mountain road and a storm and a broken hose and a man who stopped. She thought about all of that and said, yes. The snow came down on Carpenter Street, on the repair shop with the faded sign and the bay doors, on the building next to it with the new window and the light inside, on the 3 people on the sidewalk, one of whom was now making a sound that was difficult to describe except as Lily, at full volume. And it didn't care about any of the backstory, the way weather doesn't. It just came down, the same way it had a year ago on a mountain road that had turned out to be the beginning of everything. The Community Learning Center opened in March of the following year. Ethan had handled the construction. Charlotte had handled the nonprofit structure and the initial programming framework and the equipment, and argued with him about the budget in a way that was now one of their established patterns. She pushed for more. He held the line on what was practical. They ended up somewhere in the middle that worked. The Millhaven School District agreed to partner on an after-school program. Marta organized a volunteer coordination committee with the efficiency of a woman who had been organizing things in Silver Creek for 40 years and had strong feelings about doing them properly. The opening was a Saturday. The whole town came, or close enough to it. Tom Riley brought his whole family. The school district representative drove up from Millhaven and stayed for 3 hours. There was kettle corn, because Lily had made this a requirement in the planning stages, and no one had successfully argued against it. Lily gave a speech. Nobody had asked her to. She had decided to, which was different, and she had written it herself on notebook paper and read it standing on one of the work tables because she wanted to be seen, and Ethan had made a face about the table, and Charlotte had said it was fine. The speech was about the building and what it was for and why her dad had built it, and it was very good, the specific good of something written by a person who meant every word. And it was also 8 years old in the best way, with a logic that was real but not polished, and a conclusion that arrived sideways and was right anyway. She said, at the end of it, "My dad says most problems are just deferred maintenance. I think that's about cars, but I think it might also be about people. Like if you don't take care of things, they break down eventually. But if you fix them when they need it, they last a long time." She looked at her notes, then looked up. "I think this building is maintenance, for the town, and for us." She folded the paper. "Okay, that's it." The room applauded. Marta, in the back, was doing the thing where you were not going to cry and were managing it imperfectly. Ethan, beside Charlotte, said nothing. Charlotte reached over and found his hand, and he held it, and they stood in the building that he had built from the shell of something that had tried to take everything. And the spring light came through the new windows and landed on the refinished floor, and the town was there, and their daughter was there, climbing down from the work table with her notebook paper and making a beeline for the kettle corn. This is what it adds up to, Charlotte thought. Not the boardroom, not the stock recovery, not the deal or the title or the floor-to-ceiling view of a city skyline. This, a room in a small town with mismatched chairs and a projector screen and someone's child making a speech about maintenance. She thought about people who spend their lives building things that look impressive and collapse quietly from the inside. She thought about Gerald Foss, who had built something carefully and hidden it carefully, and had still, in the end, left nothing behind but a withdrawal notice in a county planning database. She thought about her own first years, the desperate forward motion, the accumulation, The construction of a self that could survive the thing that had almost taken her at 21. All of it necessary. None of it sufficient. Sufficient was here. Sufficient was a man who stopped on a road and built a building and got down on one knee on a sidewalk and made soup that looked worse than it tasted. Sufficient was a child who counted you in before you knew you'd been counted. Sufficient was a small town that knew your name and had opinions about what you did with it, and meant that as a form of caring. The things that last are the things you maintain, the things you show up for, imperfectly, on the hard weeks and the easy ones. The things you don't abandon when they get complicated, because everything real gets complicated, because complication is just the texture of mattering. You don't have to be perfect at it. You have to be present for it. That's the whole thing, Charlotte thought. That's all it is. Outside, the spring was doing what it did at that elevation. Uncertain, promising, cold enough to remind you what it had been, warm enough to show you where it was going. The mountains were still wearing their winter white at the peaks, and their new green lower down, the way they always were in March. That split-season look that the mountains around Silver Creek had, and that Charlotte had come, in the past year, to think of as one of the most honest things she'd ever seen. Not fully one thing or the other. Both at the same time, and fine with it. The kettle corn was running low, and Lily was already asking about a second batch. Ethan was explaining to Tom Riley how the work tables were mounted, and Tom was asking about the electrical specs in the way of a hardware man who found this interesting. Marta was telling someone where to move a chair, because the chair was in the wrong place, and Marta was not going to let that stand. Charlotte stood in the middle of the room and let it all be what it was. She had started one life in a hearing room, saved by evidence she didn't know the source of. She was standing in the middle of a second one now, in a building made from that same improbable continuity, everything connected across 15 years by threads she wouldn't have seen coming. You rarely see the shape of the thing while you're in it. You only get the shape afterward, looking back at the road you actually took rather than the one you planned. The one she'd taken had a broken car in it, and a storm, and a man in a canvas jacket who stopped without being asked. She thought that was a pretty good beginning, all things considered. And this, all of this, around her now, the room and the people and the mountains through the window, this was not an ending. This was just where the story had gotten to so far.